Welcome. Before tonight's story begins, take a moment to get comfortable. Where are you listening from tonight? You're always welcome to share it in the comments. If these calm, unsettling stories help you relax or drift into sleep, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Now, lower the volume, close your eyes, and let the night carry you into the story.
I spent 31 years working as a park ranger, most of that time in the backcountry of national forests where visitors were sparse and the wilderness stretched for miles in every direction without roads or facilities or any of the infrastructure that makes modern life feel safe and manageable. I preferred it that way, always did. Even from my first assignment fresh out of training, when they sent me to a remote station in the Cascades and I realized that this was what I'd been looking for without knowing I was looking for it. This solitude, this immersion in wild places where human presence was the exception rather than the rule. People would ask me over the years how I could stand the isolation, the long stretches of days, or even weeks when I might not see another person, when my only company was the forest itself and whatever animals moved through it, and my own thoughts that had nothing to bounce off except the silence and the trees and the endless variations of weather and light that marked the passage of time in those remote places. But I never minded it, never felt lonely in the way they seemed to think I should feel lonely. The forest had its own presence, its own way of filling the spaces that other people might have occupied, and I found that presence more comfortable, more honest somehow, than most human company I'd experienced. I retired 4 years ago, moved to a small town on the edge of the forest I'd spent most of my career patrolling, bought a cabin on 20 acres of land that bordered the national forest boundary, positioned so I could still see the mountains, could still wake up to that particular quality of light that comes through old-growth trees in the morning, could still feel connected to the places that had defined my working life even though I was no longer officially responsible for them. My wife had passed away 3 years before my retirement, cancer that came on fast, and took her before we'd had time to make any of the plans we'd been postponing for decades, before we'd gotten around to all the things we'd always said we'd do when we had more time, when the demands of work and life eased enough to allow for the kind of attention and presence those things required. So I was alone in the cabin, alone in a way that felt different from the solitude of backcountry ranger stations, more permanent somehow, more final. The kind of alone that comes from knowing there's no one waiting for you to come home at the end of a patrol, no one wondering where you are or whether you're safe or when you'll return. But I'd gotten used to it, had learned to structure my days around routines and projects, and the simple maintenance of existence in a place that required constant attention, constant work, constant engagement with the practical realities of keeping a property functional and livable. I still kept my old Ranger radio in the cabin, an outdated model that the Park Service had replaced with newer equipment years before I retired, but one that I'd been allowed to keep when I left, a small acknowledgement of my years of service, a token that probably meant more to me than anyone realized. I kept it on my desk in the small office I'd set up in what was supposed to be a guest bedroom, but had never hosted any guests, never served any purpose except to give me a space to organize my books and my maps and my decades of accumulated notes and photographs from my time in the backcountry. The radio still worked, still picked up transmissions from active rangers working in the forests around my property, though I rarely turned it on anymore. Found it easier to let that part of my life remain in the past rather than constantly reminding myself of what I was no longer doing, of the work I was no longer part of the purpose and structure that had defined my existence for 3 decades and had been suddenly removed when I signed the retirement papers and handed in my badge and my official equipment. But sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, when the silence of the cabin felt too heavy, or when memories of my wife made the present moment feel unbearable in its emptiness, I would turn on the radio and listen to the occasional transmissions, the routine check-ins and status updates and mundane communications that constituted most of ranger work. The ordinary business of managing wilderness areas and responding to situations and maintaining the infrastructure that allowed people to visit these places with some reasonable expectation of safety. It was comforting in a strange way, hearing those voices, knowing that the work continued without me, that the forest was still being patrolled and protected and cared for even though I was no longer the one doing it. It reminded me that I'd been part of something larger than myself, something that would continue long after I was gone, that my years of service had been a contribution to an ongoing effort that transcended any individual ranger's career or lifetime. The call came on a Tuesday night in November, about 2 months ago now, though it feels both more recent and more distant than that. Time having that strange elastic quality it gets when you're retired, and the normal markers of days and weeks blur together into an undifferentiated flow of morning and afternoon and evening and night. I'd been having trouble sleeping, nothing unusual for me, just the ordinary insomnia of age and grief and too many hours alone with my thoughts, and I'd gone to my office around midnight and turned on the old radio, tuned it to the frequency I knew the local rangers used, prepared to listen to whatever routine transmissions might be happening at that hour. The radio was mostly quiet, just occasional static, the normal background noise of electronic communication, the kind of sound you stop noticing after a while because it becomes part of the ambient environment, indistinguishable from silence unless you're paying specific attention to it. I'd pulled out one of my old topographic maps and was studying it by the light of my desk lamp, tracing routes I'd hiked decades ago, remembering specific locations and incidents and moments that had occurred along those trails, when a voice came through the radio, faint and crackling with interference, but definitely human, definitely trying to communicate something. The voice was calling for assistance, giving coordinates that I recognized immediately even though I hadn't heard them spoken in probably 15 years, coordinates for a location deep in the backcountry, a remote area that required at least 2 days of hiking to reach from the nearest trailhead, an area I knew well because I patrolled it regularly during the middle years of my career, had spent countless nights camped in that region doing wildlife surveys and trail maintenance, and the general oversight that backcountry areas require even when nobody's visiting them. The voice was requesting immediate assistance, saying there was a situation that required ranger response, that someone needed help, that this was urgent and critical and needed to be addressed as soon as possible. But something about the voice was wrong, was off in a way I couldn't immediately identify. Something about the quality of it or the cadence of the speech, or maybe just the way it came through the radio that made me pay closer attention, made me focus on what I was hearing rather than just letting it wash over me as background noise. I picked up the radio and tried to respond, identifying myself as a retired ranger, asking for clarification of the situation, offering to relay information to active personnel if needed. But there was no response, just static, just that empty crackling sound that meant either the transmission had ended or my radio couldn't reach whoever had been broadcasting. I tried several more times, varying my frequency slightly, attempting to make contact, but got nothing except silence and interference. I sat there for a long time after that, maybe 30 minutes, maybe longer, trying to decide what to do. Whether to call the ranger station and report what I'd heard, whether to trust that active rangers had also heard the transmission and were already responding, whether to dismiss the whole thing as probably some kind of technical glitch or misunderstanding that didn't require any action on my part. But something kept nagging at me, Something about that voice and those coordinates and the way the transmission had felt urgent, but also strange, off-kilter in a way I couldn't articulate or justify based on anything specific I could point to. Eventually, I decided I was probably overthinking it, probably letting my isolation and my insomnia and my detachment from active ranger work make me read too much significance into what was likely just a routine call that other rangers were already handling. I turned off the radio and went to bed, and I slept poorly, dreaming about the backcountry, about that specific location the coordinates had indicated, about hiking through dense forest in darkness, trying to reach someone who needed help, but never quite getting there, never quite closing the distance no matter how fast I moved or how long I traveled. I woke up around 6 in the morning feeling unrest and unsettled, and I made coffee and tried to focus on the ordinary routines of the day, tried to push the memory of the transmission out of my mind and return to the simple rhythms of retired life. But I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the call had been real and urgent, and that maybe nobody else had heard it. Maybe I'd been the only one listening at that particular moment on that particular frequency. Around 10 in the morning, I finally called the local ranger station, spoke to a young ranger I didn't know, someone who'd been hired after my retirement, and I explained about the transmission I'd heard, gave the coordinates, described what I could remember of the voice and the request for assistance. The young ranger was polite but clearly skeptical, said they hadn't received any reports of anyone needing help in that area, said as far as they knew there were no visitors in that part of the backcountry at this time of year, said it was possible I'd picked up some old transmission or some interference from another radio system that sometimes happened with older equipment. I thanked him and hung up, feeling foolish, feeling like an old man who couldn't let go of his former career, who was inventing significance and urgency where there was none, who needed to accept that he was no longer responsible for the forest or the people in it, that his time of service was over and he needed to move on, needed to find new ways of occupying his days and nights that didn't involve trying to recapture or relive the work that had once given his life meaning and purpose. But that night, around the same time as the previous night, around midnight, the transmission came again. Same voice, same coordinates, same urgent request for assistance. And this time I paid very close attention, tried to notice every detail about what I was hearing, tried to identify what exactly was making me feel that something was wrong with this call beyond just the fact that it was coming from a remote location. The voice was male, probably middle-aged based on the timbre and quality, speaking clearly but with strain in the tone, stress or fear or exhaustion making the words come out with a particular kind of tightness. He was saying he needed help, that there was a situation, that someone was hurt or in danger. The details were unclear, obscured by static or by the speaker's own uncertainty or by some limitation in what he was willing or able to communicate. He kept repeating the coordinates, emphasizing them as if to make absolutely sure anyone listening would know exactly where to respond. And then he said something that made my blood run cold, made me sit up straight in my chair and grip the radio with both hands. He said, "If anyone can hear this, if anyone is listening, please help us. We've been here for so long. We're still waiting. Please don't forget about us." The transmission ended after that, cut off abruptly, leaving only static and silence. I tried to respond immediately, tried to make contact, tried to ask who he was and what situation he was in and how long he'd been waiting and what kind of help he needed. But again, no response, just empty air, just the crackling of the radio receiving nothing but background noise. I sat there for a long time trying to understand what I'd heard, trying to make sense of that phrase about being there for so long, about still waiting, about not being forgotten. It suggested something that had been going on for an extended period, something that wasn't a fresh emergency, but rather a situation that had developed over time, that had perhaps been ongoing for days or weeks or even longer. But that didn't match with the urgency in the voice, with the immediate plea for help that suggested something critical happening in real time. I called the ranger station again the next morning, spoke to the same young ranger, told him about the second transmission. This time he sounded more concerned, said he'd send someone to check the area when weather permitted, when they had personnel available for what would be a multi-day expedition into remote backcountry. I asked when that might be, and he said probably not for at least a week, maybe longer, that they were short-staffed and dealing with higher priority situations closer to developed areas, that backcountry patrols weren't really feasible at this time of year when snow was starting to accumulate at higher elevations and conditions could turn dangerous quickly. I understood his position, understood the practical realities of ranger work and resource allocation, and the need to prioritize based on likelihood of actual emergency versus possible false alarm or technical malfunction. But I also felt a growing certainty that this was real, that someone actually needed help, that this wasn't interference or old transmissions or equipment problems, but rather a genuine call for assistance that was going unanswered, that was being dismissed or deprioritized or simply not taken seriously enough by people who hadn't heard the voice, hadn't picked up on whatever quality or characteristic was making me feel so certain that this mattered, that this was urgent, that someone's life or safety or well-being depended on getting help to those coordinates as quickly as possible. I spent the day preparing, going through my old backpacking gear, checking what was still usable and what had degraded over the years of storage, assembling what I'd need for a multi-day trek into the backcountry. I knew it was probably foolish, knew that at my age and with my knees that weren't what they used to be and my overall physical condition that was adequate for ordinary life, but not optimal for serious wilderness travel, I probably shouldn't attempt this alone. But I also knew I was going to do it anyway. Knew that I couldn't just sit in my cabin listening to those transmissions night after night without taking action, without at least trying to reach those coordinates and verify whether someone actually needed help. I left early the next morning, drove to the trailhead, left a note in my truck explaining where I was going and when I expected to return, a basic precaution in case something happened to me and someone needed to know where to search. The trail started out familiar, following routes I'd hiked hundreds of times during my career, passing landmarks I recognized even though they'd changed over the years, grown or eroded or been altered by weather and time, and the natural processes that constantly reshape wilderness landscapes. The first day of hiking was manageable, my body remembering the rhythms of backcountry travel even though it protested the exertion more than it used to, muscles and joints complaining about the weight of my pack and the constant uphill grades and the uneven terrain that required constant attention and adjustment. I made camp that evening at a location I'd used many times before, a flat area near a reliable water source, sheltered from wind by surrounding trees, positioned to catch morning sun that would help dry any condensation from my tent and warm me after the cold night. I set up my tent and my camp stove and ate a simple dinner as darkness fell, and then I took out my radio and turned it on, tuned it to the same frequency where I'd heard the previous transmissions. I waited, listening to static, watching the sun disappear behind the mountains and the stars emerge in that brilliant profusion you only get in true wilderness areas far from light pollution, that density of stars that makes you understand viscerally how small you are, how insignificant any individual existence is against the vast scale of the universe. Around midnight the transmission came again, but this time it was different, stronger, clearer, as if I'd moved closer to the source, or as if the source had somehow increased its broadcast power. The same voice, the same coordinates, but now with additional details, fragments of information that came through between bursts of static. He mentioned weather, mentioned cold, mentioned waiting, mentioned hoping someone would come, mentioned not knowing how much longer they could hold on. I tried to respond, identifying myself, saying I was coming, saying I'd reach the coordinates by tomorrow evening if I made good time, asking them to hold on, to stay where they were, to know that help was on the way. And this time, for just a moment, I thought I heard a response, thought I heard that same voice acknowledge my transmission, saying, "Thank you," or maybe "hurry," or maybe something else entirely. The words too distorted by interference to be certain, but definitely some kind of response, some indication that my communication had been received. I barely slept that night, too anxious to reach the coordinates, too worried about whoever was waiting there, too consumed by questions about what I would find and whether I was in time and what situation had created this need for help in the first place. I broke camp before dawn and continued hiking, pushing harder than I probably should have, taking fewer breaks than was wise, driven by a sense of urgency that overrode my normal cautious approach to backcountry travel. The terrain got rougher as I gained elevation, the trail less maintained, more overgrown, showing signs of years without regular use or upkeep. I passed through areas I remembered from decades ago, areas that had changed in subtle and not so subtle ways, trees fallen across the path, vegetation encroaching where it used to be cut back, landmarks altered by erosion or avalanche, or the slow accumulated changes that time brings to all landscapes. By late afternoon, I was getting close to the coordinates, close enough that I started paying careful attention to my GPS unit, making sure I was heading in exactly the right direction, not wanting to miss the location by even 100 yards given how difficult visibility was in the dense forest, given how easy it would be to pass within sight of someone and never see them if they were concealed by vegetation or terrain. I reached the exact coordinates just as the sun was setting, that golden hour light filtering through the trees and creating long shadows that made everything look different from how it appeared in full daylight. The location was a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by old-growth trees, positioned on a slight rise that gave a view toward distant peaks visible between gaps in the forest canopy. It was a beautiful spot, peaceful and remote, and exactly the kind of place that backcountry travelers might choose for a campsite if they were in this area. But it was empty. There was no one there, no tent, no camping equipment, no signs of recent human presence at all. I walked the perimeter of the clearing carefully, searching for any indication that someone had been here, that this was indeed the location they'd been calling from. Nothing. Just undisturbed forest floor, just the ordinary accumulation of needles and leaves and small debris that covers ground in wilderness areas, just the silent presence of trees and rocks and the fading light of approaching dusk. I called out, my voice sounding strange and too loud in the stillness, announcing that I was a ranger, that I'd come in response to their call, that I was here to help if they needed assistance. No response except the small sounds of forest adjusting to evening, birds settling, wind moving through upper branches, the distant sound of water flowing somewhere below me down the slope. I set up my tent in the clearing and made camp as darkness fell completely. And then I took out my radio and waited for midnight, waited for the transmission that I was now certain would come, that had been coming every night at approximately the same time, that had led me to this exact location for reasons I didn't yet understand but was determined to discover. Midnight came, and the radio remained silent. I waited, listening to static, watching the darkness beyond my small circle of firelight, feeling the cold of a November night at elevation seeping into my bones despite my sleeping bag and my layers of clothing. 1 o'clock came, then 2, then 3, and still nothing. Just silence. Just the empty crackling of radio receiving nothing but background noise and interference. Around 3:30, I finally gave up and tried to sleep, exhausted from 2 days of hard hiking, confused by the absence of any sign of the person who'd been calling for help, starting to doubt my own judgment in coming out here, starting to think maybe the young ranger at the station had been right. Maybe it had been old transmissions or interference or some kind of technical problem with my radio, rather than genuine calls for assistance from this specific location. But I couldn't quite believe that, couldn't quite accept that explanation despite the evidence in front of me, despite the empty clearing and the silent radio and the complete absence of anything that would justify my presence here. Something had led me to this place. Something had been broadcasting from these coordinates. Something had created that voice requesting help and saying they'd been waiting for so long. I must have fallen asleep eventually because I woke to morning light and the sound of rain starting to fall. Light at first, but steady. The kind of rain that settles in for hours and makes everything damp and cold and miserable. I stayed in my tent for a while, listening to the rain on the fabric, thinking about what to do next, whether to head back or wait another night, whether to search the surrounding area more thoroughly or accept that I'd made a mistake, that I'd misunderstood something fundamental about the situation. Eventually, I decided to do a systematic search of the area within a half-mile radius of the coordinates, covering all the terrain I could reasonably access, looking for any sign of human presence, any indication of what might have prompted those transmissions. I spent the entire day doing this, hiking in expanding circles from the clearing, checking every drainage and ridge and possible camping spot, finding nothing except pristine wilderness, undisturbed forest, the ordinary landscape of backcountry that sees few visitors and shows no signs of recent human activity. By evening, I was soaked and cold and discouraged, starting to accept that maybe I'd been wrong, that maybe my need to feel useful and purposeful had made me interpret random radio interference as genuine calls for help, had made me see urgency and meaning where there was only technical malfunction and my own loneliness and desire to recapture the sense of purpose that my career had provided. I returned to the clearing and built a fire, trying to dry out some of my gear, trying to warm myself enough to sleep despite the cold rain that continued falling steadily. I made dinner and ate without much appetite, and then I sat by the fire listening to the rain and the darkness and the profound silence of the forest at night, that particular quality of quiet that exists in wild places, that isn't really silence, but rather the absence of human sound, the presence of natural sound so constant and pervasive that it becomes invisible, becomes the background against which any unusual or out-of-place sound would stand out immediately. I took out my radio around 11, turned it on even though I expected nothing, even though I was prepared to hike out the next morning and return to my cabin and accept that I'd been foolish, that I'd let my isolation and my grief and my inability to let go of my ranger identity lead me on a pointless expedition into the wilderness chasing a voice that existed only in my imagination or my malfunctioning equipment. Midnight came, and at first there was only static, only the normal background noise I'd been hearing for hours. But then, faint but distinct, the voice came through again, clearer than before, stronger, more immediate. And what it said made me understand everything, made me realize what I'd been hearing all along, made me comprehend why the clearing was empty and why no one had responded to my calls, and why the transmissions kept coming night after night from coordinates that showed no evidence of human presence. The voice said, "This is Ranger Michael Chun. requesting immediate assistance at the following coordinates. And then it gave the same coordinates I'd been hearing all along, the same location where I was sitting at that very moment. And then it said, "We've had an accident. My partner is seriously injured. We need emergency medical evacuation as soon as possible. This is November 14th, 1993. Please respond. Please send help." I sat there holding the radio, feeling something cold spread through my chest, understanding finally that this wasn't a current emergency, wasn't someone calling for help in real time. This was an old transmission, a call from 30 years ago, from before I'd even been assigned to this region, from a time when I was still working in a different forest hundreds of miles away, learning the basics of backcountry ranger work and gaining the experience that would eventually lead to my transfer here. But it wasn't just an old transmission playing back somehow, wasn't just interference or equipment malfunction creating the illusion of current communication. Because the transmission was still happening, was still being broadcast night after night, was still calling for help 3 decades after it had first been sent, still waiting for someone to respond, someone to come, someone to provide the assistance that apparently had never arrived, or had arrived too late, or had somehow failed to resolve whatever situation had prompted that original desperate call. I tried to respond, tried to reach across the 30 years that separated my present moment from that November night in 1993 when Ranger Michael Chun had called for help from these exact coordinates. I said I was here, said I'd received his transmission, said I was a ranger and I wanted to help, but I needed to know what had happened, needed to understand what situation I was responding to, needed information about what assistance was required. For a long moment, there was only static, and I thought the transmission had ended, that whatever strange phenomenon had been allowing this 3-decade-old call to reach my radio had ceased, had closed off the connection between then and now, between his emergency and my present moment. But then his voice came through again, fainter now, more distant, as if the signal was weakening or the gap between us was widening. He said, "We're at the old shelter near Marston Creek. My partner fell, hit his head. He's unconscious. I don't know how bad it is. We need medical help. Please hurry." And then the transmission cut off completely, leaving only silence, only the rain and the darkness and my own breathing loud in my ears. I sat there trying to process what I'd heard, trying to understand what it meant and what I should do with this information. The old shelter near Marston Creek. I knew that location, or I knew where it had been, because I'd hiked past the ruins of it many times during my career. It had been built in the 1970s as an emergency shelter for rangers and visitors, a small structure positioned at a strategic location along what had been a more frequently traveled route before trail systems were reorganized in the late 90s. But it had been abandoned and eventually demolished in the early 2000s, considered structurally unsound and no longer necessary given changes in how the backcountry was managed and accessed. The shelter had been about 2 miles from where I was currently camped, downslope following a creek drainage, a difficult hike in daylight and treacherous in darkness and rain, but not impossible for someone who knew the terrain and was motivated by the kind of urgency I was feeling. I made the decision quickly, didn't allow myself time to think about how foolish it was to hike in darkness through difficult terrain, didn't consider the risks or the practical improbability of finding anything useful at a location where a shelter had been demolished 20 years ago. I packed my essential gear, left my tent standing in case I needed to return to it, took my headlamp and my GPS and my first aid kit and some emergency supplies, and I started hiking toward where the shelter had been, following terrain I remembered from old patrols, from maps I'd studied and routes I'd taken countless times during my years of backcountry work. The rain continued falling, making the ground slippery, making roots and rocks treacherous, making visibility difficult despite my headlamp. But I moved as quickly as I dared, driven by the irrational but powerful conviction that I needed to reach that location, needed to see what was there, needed to understand what had happened 30 years ago and why those transmissions were still being broadcast decades later. It took me almost 2 hours to cover the 2 miles, twice as long as it would have taken in daylight under good conditions. But eventually I found the location, recognized the flat area where the shelter had stood, saw the remains of the foundation still visible despite years of vegetation growth and natural reclamation. I stood there in the rain, shining my headlamp around the area, looking for anything that might explain why I'd been led here, why a 30-year-old emergency call had somehow reached across time to my radio, why I felt so certain that coming to this place mattered even though logic and reason suggested this was pointless, that whatever had happened here had happened decades ago, and there was nothing I could do now to help or change or resolve. And then I saw it, partially obscured by brush and debris, barely visible in the darkness and rain, but unmistakable once I focused my light directly on it. A backpack, old and weathered and partially decomposed, but still recognizable as the kind of external frame pack that rangers used in the early 90s, before internal frame designs became standard. I approached it carefully, pulled it free from the vegetation that had grown around it, opened it with hands that were shaking from cold and exhaustion and something else, some emotion I couldn't quite name, but that felt like grief and recognition and the weight of understanding something terrible that had been hidden for too long. Inside were personal effects, a wallet with an ID card, a ranger badge, a notebook with entries dated from November 1993, weather observations and trail conditions, and routine patrol notes written in careful handwriting that became increasingly rushed and stressed as the entries progressed, until the final entry on November 14th that said simply, "Mark fell. Head injury. Called for help. Waiting." And then nothing else. No more entries. Just blank pages that had never been filled. Just the abrupt ending of a record that should have continued but didn't, that stopped at the moment of emergency and never resumed. The ID card showed a young man, probably in his late 20s, Asian features, serious expression, the kind of official photograph that gets taken for credentials and badges and never really captures what someone actually looks like. Just provides basic identification without personality or character or any sense of the human being behind the image. The name on the card read Michael Chun, and below it the designation Park Ranger, and a date of issue that placed it 3 years before that final entry in his notebook. I sat down on the wet ground, holding his pack and his effects, understanding finally what had happened here, or at least understanding enough to know that something had gone terribly wrong. That Ranger Michael Chun and his partner Mark had come to this location in November 1993, that Mark had been injured, that Michael had called for help, and that somehow the help had never come, or had come too late, or had failed to find them despite his transmissions, despite his clear statements of their location, despite his repeated calls night after night that apparently no one had heard or responded to except me. 3 decades later, listening to a radio that shouldn't have been able to receive those transmissions, that had no logical reason to pick up calls from the past. I spent the rest of that night in the ruins of the old shelter, searching the area more thoroughly as dawn broke and visibility improved, finding more evidence of what had occurred. Another backpack, presumably Mark's, positioned near where the shelter's wall would have been, providing some minimal protection from weather. Signs of a makeshift camp, cold fire pit, arrangements that suggested someone trying to maintain warmth and stability while waiting for rescue that apparently never arrived. And finally, about 50 feet down the slope in a drainage area, partially concealed by years of deposited debris and vegetation. I found what I'd been dreading I might find, what some part of me had known I would find from the moment I'd understood those transmissions were coming from the past. Human remains, two sets, positioned close together as if one person had been trying to protect or comfort the other, bones and remnants of clothing and equipment that had weathered 3 decades of exposure to elements and animals and the slow process of natural decomposition and reclamation. I marked the location with my GPS, took photographs with my phone, documented everything as carefully as I could while maintaining the respect and dignity that the situation demanded, that the dead deserved even if they'd been dead for 30 years, even if no one had known they were here, even if their final transmissions calling for help had gone unheard and unanswered by everyone except me, decades too late to provide the assistance they'd needed. I hiked out that day, made it back to my truck by late afternoon, drove directly to the ranger station, and reported what I'd found. The young ranger I'd spoken to before looked shocked, looked like he couldn't quite process what I was telling him, like the idea of 2 rangers dying in the backcountry and never being found for 3 decades seemed impossible, seemed like something that couldn't happen, that shouldn't have been able to happen in an era of radio communication and organized search and rescue, and all the systems that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. But it had happened, and over the next few weeks as authorities investigated and recovered the remains and went through old records trying to piece together what had occurred, the story emerged in fragments and pieces that never quite formed a complete picture but provided enough information to understand the basic outline of the tragedy. Rangers Michael Chun and Mark Sullivan had been on routine backcountry patrol in November 1993. They'd radioed in their itinerary and expected return date. And then they'd simply disappeared, failed to return on schedule, failed to check in, failed to respond to subsequent radio calls attempting to reach them. A search had been conducted, multiple teams covering the areas where they were believed to be patrolling, but the search had been hampered by early winter storms, by heavy snow that made backcountry travel dangerous and limited visibility and concealed any signs or tracks that might have led searchers to the right location. After 2 weeks, the search had been called off. The missing rangers presumed dead, but their bodies never recovered. Their final resting place unknown. Their fate a mystery that had gradually faded from active concern as years passed, and new rangers rotated through the station, and the tragedy became just another sad story from the past, another reminder of the dangers inherent in backcountry work. But now they'd been found, and now their families could finally have closure, could finally know what had happened, and where they'd been, and could finally lay them to rest properly after 3 decades of not knowing, of wondering, of carrying the burden of that uncertainty and unanswered questions. The investigation determined that Mark had likely died from his head injury within hours of the accident, that Michael had survived longer, had kept calling for help on his radio, had done everything right according to his training and protocols, but that his transmissions had somehow failed to reach anyone who could respond, either due to radio malfunction or atmospheric conditions, or the unfortunate combination of his location and the frequency he was using and the fact that no one happened to be listening at the right time on the right channel. He died there next to his partner, probably from exposure and hypothermia as November temperatures dropped and snow began to fall. Died while waiting for rescue that never came. Died still hoping that someone would hear his calls and respond and come to help them. The medical examiner estimated he'd survive perhaps 3 or 4 days after the initial accident, perhaps longer, plenty of time for rescue if his location had been known, if someone had heard his transmissions, if the search teams had looked in the right area instead of the wrong ones. And somehow, through some mechanism that no one could explain, or even speculate about with any confidence. His calls had continued, had kept broadcasting across the years, had somehow persisted in a way that defied normal understanding of how radio waves work or how time functions or how the physical universe operates according to the laws we think we understand. His final transmissions had echoed through 3 decades, had finally reached someone who could hear them even if that someone couldn't provide the help they'd needed when they'd needed it, could only bear witness to what had happened and ensure that they were finally found, finally recovered, finally brought home to families who'd been grieving them for 30 years. I attended both memorial services, felt it was important to be there even though I'd never known them, had never worked with them, had no connection to them except being the person who'd finally found them, who'd finally heard their calls and responded even if the response came 3 decades too late to matter in any practical sense. The services were held 2 weeks apart. First Mark Sullivan's in his hometown about an hour from here, then Michael Chin's in the city where his family had settled after his disappearance. Both were attended by retired rangers who'd known them, by family members who'd spent 30 years wondering what had happened, by people who'd been part of the search efforts back in 1993 and had carried the weight of not finding them, of having to give up, of having to accept that sometimes people vanish into wilderness and never come back, never provide answers, never allow for proper closure or grieving. I stood in the back at both services, not wanting to intrude on family grief, not wanting to draw attention to myself, just wanting to be present, to witness, to pay my respects to 2 rangers who died doing the work I'd done for 3 decades, who'd experienced the nightmare scenario that every backcountry ranger thinks about occasionally, but mostly pushes out of mind because you have to. Because you can't do the work if you're constantly dwelling on all the ways it could go wrong, all the situations where help might not arrive in time, where your radio calls might not reach anyone, where you might end up alone and injured and dying in some remote location while the world continues on without you. Michael's father approached me after his son's service, an elderly man in his 80s, moving slowly but with dignity, his face showing the accumulated grief of 3 decades of not knowing followed by the fresh grief of finally knowing, of having his worst fears confirmed after years of hoping against hope that maybe his son had survived somehow, had amnesia maybe, was living somewhere under a different name, would someday remember and come home. He thanked me for finding them, for not giving up, for listening to those impossible transmissions, and choosing to respond even though it made no logical sense, even though I'd had every reason to dismiss them as technical problems or interference or the confused perceptions of an isolated retired ranger who couldn't let go of his former career. He asked me if his son had suffered, if the end had been painful, if Michael had been afraid, or if he'd maintained his composure and professionalism even in those final hours and days. I told him what I believed to be true based on the evidence, based on the way the camp had been arranged, based on the notebook entries that showed careful documentation even as the situation deteriorated, based on my own experience of what it's like to be in backcountry in November when weather turns bad and you're waiting for help that doesn't come as quickly as you need it to. I told him I thought Michael had done everything right, had followed his training, had maintained hope and discipline, had stayed with his injured partner rather than attempting to hike out for help, which would have meant leaving Mark alone and might have resulted in both of them dying separately rather than together. I told him that Michael's final radio transmissions, the ones that had somehow persisted across 3 decades, showed him still calm, still professional, still believing that help would come, still fulfilling his duty as a ranger to report emergencies and request assistance and protect the people he was responsible for. I told him that based on the medical examiner's report, both rangers had likely died without excessive suffering, That hypothermia in its final stages brings a kind of peaceful drowsiness, that they'd been together rather than alone, that they'd had shelter and supplies, and had done everything possible given their circumstances. I told him what I hoped was true, what I needed to believe was true, what the evidence suggested even if it couldn't be proven with certainty, which was that his son had been a good ranger, had done his job while even in the worst possible situation, had remained true to his training and his character and his commitment to the work right up until the end. Michael's father thanked me again, shook my hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone his age, and told me that the family was grateful, that finally knowing what had happened was better than 30 more years of not knowing, of wondering, of hoping and fearing and living in that terrible limbo where grief can't be processed properly because there's no body, no confirmation, no definitive ending to allow for acceptance and moving forward. He said they could finally lay his son to rest properly now, could finally mark his passing with the rituals and ceremonies that help families say goodbye, could finally begin the process of remembering him as he'd been in life rather than as the eternal question mark he'd become after his disappearance. I left both services feeling heavy with emotions I couldn't quite name, feelings that mixed grief and guilt and relief, and something else, something about having completed a task I hadn't known I was responsible for, about having served as the unlikely connection between past emergency and present resolution, about having been the person who happened to be listening at the right moment with the right equipment tuned to the right frequency to hear calls that no one else could hear. That shouldn't have been possible to hear according to any normal understanding of how radio communication works. The weeks following the memorial services were strange for me, filled with a mixture of media attention I hadn't expected and didn't particularly want, and quiet hours alone in my cabin trying to process what had happened, trying to understand what it meant, trying to figure out how to move forward after being pulled so dramatically back into the world of active ranger work, even if only briefly. Even if only in this odd capacity of responding to emergencies from 3 decades in the past. News outlets ran stories about the discovery, about the tragic fate of the 2 rangers, about the mysterious radio transmissions that had led to finding them after 30 years. Some articles speculated about paranormal explanations, about ghosts or echoes in time or spirits trying to communicate from beyond death. Others focused on technical theories, atmospheric conditions that might have captured and preserved radio signals, equipment malfunctions that might have created the illusion of recent transmissions from old recordings, scientific explanations that strained credibility but at least stayed within the boundaries of materialist understanding of how the universe works. I declined most interview requests, spoke briefly to a few reporters who seemed genuinely interested in the Rangers rather than in the sensational aspects of how they'd been found, tried to keep the focus on Michael Chun and Mark Sullivan and their service and their sacrifice rather than on my role or the unusual circumstances of the discovery. I didn't mention specific details about the transmissions, about what Michael's voice had said across those 3 decades, about the phrases that had convinced me someone needed help, about the impossible conversation I'd had with a dead man's radio calls persisting long after his physical death. Some things felt too personal to share with journalists or the general public, too sacred in some way I couldn't articulate, too important to risk having them reduced to entertainment or curiosity or the kind of story people tell at parties to elicit reactions of surprise or disbelief. The transmissions had been real to me, had been genuine communication even if the mechanism remained inexplicable, had been a dying ranger's last calls for help finally reaching someone who could respond even if the response came far too late to save lives, but at least in time to provide closure and recovery and proper burial. I thought about those transmissions constantly during the weeks and months after finding them. Thought about what it meant that I'd heard them, why I'd been the one listening at the right moment, whether there was any significance to the timing beyond simple coincidence, whether Michael's consciousness or spirit or some echo of his final desperate hours had somehow reached across time specifically to find me, specifically to ensure that he and Mark would eventually be found, that their story would eventually be told, that they wouldn't remain missing forever, forgotten in some remote clearing while the forest slowly reclaimed their remains. I didn't believe in ghosts, had never believed in supernatural phenomena, had spent my career in wilderness dealing with very physical realities, very material concerns, very tangible problems that had practical solutions, or at least practical approaches. But I also couldn't explain what had happened using any framework that stayed within materialist boundaries. Couldn't account for those transmissions through normal radio physics, or atmospheric conditions, or equipment malfunction. Couldn't rationalize them into anything that made sense according to how I understood the world to work. And gradually, over time, I came to accept that maybe I didn't need to explain it, didn't need to understand the mechanism, didn't need to fit it into existing categories of possible and impossible. Maybe it was enough to know that it had happened, that I'd heard those calls and responded to them, that two rangers who died alone in wilderness 3 decades ago had finally been found and brought home to their families and given proper burial and memorial. Maybe the why and how mattered less than the fact that it had occurred, that something had led me to turn on my old radio on those particular nights, that something had allowed those transmissions to reach me across 30 years of time. I started thinking more about the nature of time itself during those months, about whether it's really as linear and unidirectional as we usually assume, about whether past and present and future are as separate and distinct as our everyday experience suggests. Michael's calls for help had been transmitted in 1993, had been sent out into the universe on radio waves that should have dissipated quickly, that should have weakened and faded and become undetectable within hours or days at most, that certainly shouldn't have remained coherent and intelligible for 3 decades before finally reaching a receiver tuned to listen. But they had. Somehow they had persisted or been preserved or been captured and replayed, or whatever mechanism had allowed them to bridge that gap of 30 years between transmission and reception. And if that was possible, if radio signals could somehow escape the normal temporal progression and remain accessible decades after being broadcast, what did that suggest about time itself, about the nature of past and present, about whether events that we think of as finished and gone might in some sense continue to exist, continue to be accessible under the right conditions, continue to call out for response and resolution even long after they've supposedly ended? These weren't questions I could answer, weren't speculations I could resolve through research or study or consultation with experts. They were philosophical puzzles that had suddenly become personally relevant, theoretical issues that had manifested in my direct experience in ways I couldn't dismiss or ignore or rationalize away. Time had revealed itself to be stranger than I had previously understood, more flexible or permeable or multi-layered, capable of configurations and connections that shouldn't be possible but apparently were. I continued to keep my old radio, continued to turn it on occasionally during late-night hours when I couldn't sleep, continued to listen to the routine transmissions of active rangers going about their work in the forests around my property. But I also listened for other things now, listened for transmissions that seemed wrong or out of place, listened for calls that might be coming from times other than the present, listened for voices that might be reaching across years or decades seeking help that hadn't arrived when they needed it. I never heard anything like Michael Chin's transmissions again, never picked up other calls from the past, never experienced another instance of temporal radio communication or whatever it should properly be called. The frequencies carried only current conversations, only present moment communications, only the ordinary business of ranger work happening in real time with no echoes from past emergencies, no calls from long ago crises still seeking resolution. But I remained vigilant, remained attentive, remained open to the possibility that it might happen again, that other rangers from other times might be trying to reach across temporal gaps to ensure they weren't forgotten, to request help even if that help could only come in the form of recovery and burial and memorial rather than rescue and survival. Because if it had happened once, if Michael's calls had somehow persisted for 30 years before finding a listener, then it seemed possible it could happen again, could happen with other emergencies, other rangers, other people who died in wilderness waiting for help that never came. I thought about writing down everything I remembered about the transmissions, creating a detailed record of what I'd heard and when and how, preserving the specifics in case they might be useful to someone someday, to researchers studying temporal anomalies or physicists trying to understand time or other rangers who might experience similar phenomena and need to know they weren't crazy, that others had encountered this strangeness before. But I never quite got around to it, never quite managed to commit the experience to paper in any comprehensive way, perhaps because some part of me worried that writing it down would fix it too concretely, would force it into narrative and explanation and framework when maybe it was better left as pure experience, as something that had happened but didn't need to be analyzed or categorized or made to fit into larger theoretical structures. The seasons changed, winter giving way to spring, spring to summer, the forest cycling through its annual transformations while I remained in my cabin on the edge of wilderness, living my retired life, maintaining my property, filling my days with projects and routines that kept me occupied, if not exactly fulfilled. The discovery of the two rangers had given me a brief return to purpose, a temporary sense of being useful and necessary, of having skills and knowledge that mattered for something beyond my own personal survival and comfort. But that had faded as the investigation concluded, as the memorial services ended, as the media attention moved on to other stories, leaving me once again alone with my grief and my memories and my long nights when sleep wouldn't come. But something had changed. Something had shifted in how I understood my relationship to the forest and to ranger work and to time itself. I'd been the connection between a past emergency and present resolution, had served as the unlikely medium through which help finally arrived, even if it came 3 decades late, had proven that radio calls for assistance could persist across years, across decades, waiting for the right listener at the right moment tuned to the right frequency, with the willingness to take them seriously despite their apparent impossibility. And that meant something. Meant that my years of service hadn't ended completely when I retired. Meant that experience and knowledge and attentiveness could still be valuable, could still serve purposes I hadn't anticipated, could still connect me to the work I'd loved even if I was no longer doing it actively, no longer patrolling backcountry, no longer carrying official responsibility for wilderness and the people in it. I started volunteering at the local ranger station after that, not in any official capacity, just offering to help with training new rangers, sharing knowledge about the backcountry areas I'd patrolled for decades, providing historical context about trails and landmarks and incidents that had occurred in past years. The young rangers were respectful, were genuinely interested in what I had to share, seemed to understand that experience accumulated over 31 years contained valuable information that couldn't be learned from manuals or training programs, that could only come from time spent in wilderness, from years of responding to situations and solving problems and learning how forests work, how weather patterns develop, how people behave when they're lost or injured or frightened. And I felt useful again, felt connected to something larger than my own isolated existence, felt like I was contributing even in this small way to the ongoing work of protecting wilderness and serving the people who visited it. The discovery of Michael Chun and Mark Sullivan had given me this, had shown me that retirement didn't have to mean complete disconnection, that there were ways to remain involved, to stay relevant, to continue serving even after official careers ended. I still think about them often, still remember those impossible transmissions, still wonder about the mechanism that allowed Michael's voice to reach across 30 years of time. I think about him sitting in that old shelter next to his dying partner, broadcasting calls for help into the November darkness, hoping someone would hear, would respond, would send assistance before it was too late. I think about him continuing to call even as his own condition deteriorated, even as hypothermia set in, even as hope must have faded that rescue would arrive in time, maintaining his duty as a ranger to report emergencies and request help right up until the end. And I think about the strange mercy of those transmissions persisting, of them finally reaching someone decades later, of them serving their purpose even if not in the way Michael had hoped, not bringing rescue but bringing discovery, bringing recovery, bringing an end to the mystery and allowing his family and Mark's family to finally grieve properly, to finally say goodbye, to finally know what had happened to their sons who'd gone into wilderness 3 decades ago and never come home. The last call from a retired ranger. That's what this is, this story I'm telling now. This account of what happened during those strange November nights when I heard a voice from the past and chose to respond, chose to believe, chose to act despite having no logical reason to think those transmissions were real or current or warranted the kind of response I ultimately gave them. I'm retired, have been for 4 years now, no longer carry official responsibility for anything beyond my own property and my own life. But I answered that call anyway, hiked into backcountry despite my age and my deteriorating knees and my awareness that I was probably chasing nothing, probably wasting my time and energy on a fool's errand based on equipment malfunction and my own inability to let go of my identity as a ranger. But it wasn't a fool's errand, wasn't equipment malfunction, wasn't my imagination or confusion or the desperate grasping of a lonely old man who missed his career and his wife and the sense of purpose both had provided. It was real, was genuine, was a connection across time that allowed me to complete a rescue that should have happened 3 decades earlier, that brought 2 missing rangers home to their families, that provided closure and burial and memorial and the acknowledgement that their deaths had mattered, that they'd been good rangers who'd done everything right but had fallen victim to circumstances beyond their control, to the unfortunate combination of injury and weather and search teams looking in, wrong locations and radio transmissions that hadn't reached anyone who could respond until decades later when only recovery remained possible rather than rescue. I'm grateful for it now, grateful that I happened to turn on my radio those particular nights, grateful that I was listening at the right frequency at the right moments, grateful that something about my equipment or my location or my receptivity allowed those transmissions to reach me when they apparently hadn't reached anyone else in 30 years. It gave me purpose again, gave me one last mission, one final response to a call for help even if that help came far too late to save lives, but at least in time to provide dignity and closure and proper respect for rangers who died doing work I'd done for most of my adult life. The forest continues outside my window, continues its cycles of growth and decay, continues to be what it's always been regardless of human presence or absence, regardless of our dramas and emergencies and attempts to manage and protect and understand it. And I continue in my cabin on the edge of wilderness, continues my retired life, continue to listen to my old radio occasionally during late nights when sleep won't come, continue to pay attention to transmissions both current and possibly from other times, continue to remain ready to respond if another impossible call should come. If another ranger from another time should reach out seeking help that didn't arrive when needed, but might still be provided decades later in the form of discovery and recovery and memorial. That's what I learned from the last call, from those transmissions that shouldn't have been possible, from Michael Chin's voice reaching across 30 years of time. I learned that help can come late and still matter, that closure is valuable even decades after tragedy, that the work of rangers continues beyond retirement and beyond death, that wilderness holds mysteries we don't fully understand and probably never will. That time is stranger than we usually acknowledge, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply listen, simply pay attention, simply remain open to experiences that don't fit our existing frameworks of understanding, but that might nonetheless be real and meaningful and desperately in need of response. The last call from a retired ranger was answered, was acted upon, led to discovery and resolution and the return home of two rangers who'd been missing for 3 decades. And I'm the one who answered it, the one who listened, the one who believed enough to act despite all the logical reasons not to. That's my story now, my final contribution to the work I did for 31 years. My last response to a call for help in wilderness, my proof that retirement doesn't mean disconnection, that experience matters, that paying attention matters, that some responsibilities transcend official positions and active careers and the normal temporal boundaries that we think separate past from present, helping from being helped, searching from being found. And I'll keep listening, keep my radio active, keep my skills and knowledge available for whatever might be needed, whether that's training new rangers or responding to impossible transmissions or simply maintaining my connection to wilderness and to the work that defined me for so long and still defines me even now, even in retirement, even living alone in a cabin on the edge of forest that I no longer officially protect, but still love, still understand, still feel responsible for in ways that have nothing to do with employment status or official duty and everything to do with who I am and what I know and what I learned during 3 decades of serving as a link between people and wilderness, between emergency and response, between calls for help and the hope that someone, somewhere, is listening.
I've started researching the history of the park more carefully, looking for any previous reports of unusual lights, any documentation of strange phenomena, any indication that other rangers or visitors or researchers have seen what I've been seeing. And I've found scattered references, brief mentions in old reports, occasional comments in ranger journals from decades ago, suggestions that these lights or something like them have been observed before, have been part of the park's landscape for longer than my 12 years, possibly for as long as the park has existed, possibly for even longer than that. One entry from a ranger journal dated 1967 describes peculiar luminescence in the northern reaches during January patrols, source undetermined, worthy of further investigation though no immediate concern. Another from 1983 mentions unusual light phenomena during closure season, potentially atmospheric in nature, creates radio interference, observed multiple times but no explanation identified. Another from 1998 documents recurring unexplained illumination in backcountry areas during winter months, appears to follow consistent route over multiple seasons, recommend continued monitoring. So it's not just me, not just my experiences, not just my 8 years of observations but rather a pattern that extends back decades, that multiple rangers have encountered and documented and tried to understand, that has persisted through changes in personnel and equipment and management approaches. That appears to be a consistent feature of the park rather than an anomaly or aberration or individual rangers' misperceptions. This discovery validates what I've been experiencing but also makes it more mysterious, more significant, suggests that these lights or whatever creates them is part of the park in some fundamental way, is perhaps as much a component of this landscape as the trees and the streams and the animals, just operating according to different rules. Just existing in ways we don't normally acknowledge or perceive or have frameworks for understanding. I think about the Native American tribes that lived in this area before it became a national park, before it became managed wilderness, before it became recreational facility for visitors from cities who want temporary exposure to nature without giving up the safety and convenience that civilization provides. I think about their relationship to this land, their understanding of it, their awareness of features and presences and phenomena that don't appear in our scientific surveys or management plans or visitor guides, that exist in their cosmology but not in ours, that they recognized and respected and incorporated into their worldview in ways we've lost or never had. And I wonder if these lights are part of that older understanding, part of what this place was before we renamed it and mapped it and fenced it and turned it into national park, part of its nature that persists despite our management and our assumptions about what wilderness is and what it contains and what's possible within the boundaries we've drawn on maps and enforced with regulations and protected with our patrols and our presence. The park ranger who follows lights in a closed national park, that's what I am now, that's how I think of myself, that's the role I've somehow taken on during these past 8 years of closure seasons, these winters when the park empties and the boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary become more permeable, when things that remain hidden during busy seasons become visible to those who are present and paying attention and willing to observe without immediately demanding explanations that fit comfortable categories. I don't know what the lights are, don't know where they're going, don't know why they move through the park during closure season following a route that appears deliberate and purposeful. I don't know why they affect radio equipment, why they disappear when approached, why encounter with them creates altered experiences of time and space and perception. I don't know if they're aware, conscious, intelligent in any sense I'd recognize, or if they're just phenomena, just occurrences, just features of the landscape that have qualities that seem like awareness and intention but are actually just complex patterns we don't understand. But I know they exist, know they've existed for decades, know they'll appear again next winter when the park closes and empties and becomes itself again rather than the managed recreational facility it plays during open season. And I'll be there watching for them, documenting them, trying to understand them, serving as the witness to something that most people will never see, that most rangers will never encounter, that exists in the spaces between our maps and our categories and our comfortable assumptions about what's real and what's possible in wilderness areas we think we understand because we've named them and bounded them and declared them protected. The lights continue their journey through closed park, moving slowly toward whatever destination they're approaching, following a route that predates our presence, that will continue after we're gone, that exists independent of whether anyone observes them or documents them or tries to understand them. And I continue my patrols, continue my duties, continue my role as the ranger who follows lights in closed national park, who maintains his watch during empty winters, who serves as the connection between the park as we understand it and the park as it actually is, complex and mysterious and containing presences that don't fit our frameworks but exist nonetheless. Moving through darkness toward purposes we may never comprehend but can at least witness, can at least respect, can at least acknowledge as part of what wilderness means when we strip away all our assumptions and our management and our need to categorize everything into explainable terms. Next winter will come, closure season will arrive, the park will empty of visitors and return to its winter self, and the lights will appear again somewhere in the northern section, continuing their slow progression, their deliberate journey through landscape that holds more than our maps indicate, more than our surveys reveal, more than our understanding encompasses. And I'll be there watching, documenting, following them through closed park, maintaining my vigil, serving my purpose as the ranger who sees what others miss, who pays attention during the seasons when attention is scarce, who witnesses the ongoing mystery of lights moving through wilderness toward destinations unknown. My wife left me 6 months ago, moved back to her parents' house in the city, said she couldn't live with someone who'd become so obsessed with something that couldn't be explained, who spent more time thinking about mysterious lights than about their marriage, who'd chosen investigation over relationship, solitude over companionship, mystery over the ordinary demands of shared life. I can't say she was wrong, can't argue that my priorities had remained balanced, can't claim I'd been fully present in our relationship when so much of my attention was focused on those winter patrols, those closure season observations, those attempts to understand phenomena that most people would dismiss or ignore or rationalize away. She'd tried to understand at first, had listened when I talked about the lights, had looked at my maps and my documentation, had even come with me once during an off-season patrol to see if she could observe what I'd been seeing. But we didn't see anything that night, the lights didn't appear when she was present, and I think that confirmed her suspicion that maybe they were products of isolation or stress or my own psychological state rather than genuine phenomena existing independent of my perception. She started suggesting I talk to someone, started mentioning counseling or therapy or at minimum taking a break from solo winter patrols, started treating my observations as symptoms rather than as legitimate experiences worthy of investigation. And maybe she was right, maybe I do need help, maybe my obsession with these lights indicates something broken in me rather than something genuine in the park. But I can't accept that, can't dismiss 8 years of consistent observations, can't explain away the radio failures and the time distortions and the historical documentation and all the evidence that suggests these lights are real features of the landscape rather than hallucinations or delusions or misperceptions created by spending too much time alone in empty wilderness. So I live alone now in the small house near the park entrance that used to be our home but is now just mine, spend my days doing my ranger duties and my evenings reviewing my documentation, studying my maps, analyzing the patterns, preparing for next closure season when I'll have another opportunity to observe the lights, to follow them, to try to understand what they are and where they're going and what their presence in this park means about the nature of wilderness and reality and all the things we think we understand but maybe don't. I've started corresponding with researchers who study anomalous phenomena, who investigate unexplained lights and radio interference and temporal distortions, who approach these topics from scientific perspectives rather than dismissing them as impossible or attributing them to supernatural causes. Most of them are skeptical of my reports, ask for evidence I can't provide, want photographs or video or physical samples or reproducible measurements, want the kind of documentation that these lights don't allow because they disappear when approached and affect the very equipment that might be used to document them. But a few of them take my observations seriously, recognize patterns in what I'm describing that match other phenomena they've studied, suggest theoretical frameworks that might account for lights that move with apparent intention, that affect electromagnetic equipment, that create altered experiences of time and space. They talk about quantum effects and consciousness and the relationship between observation and reality, about how measuring something changes it, about how some phenomena might exist in states that are fundamentally incompatible with documentation, that reveal themselves only to direct experience rather than to technological mediation. These conversations help, provide validation that I'm not simply losing my mind, that there are people who take these experiences seriously even if they can't explain them, that the boundary between known and unknown is more complex than mainstream science usually acknowledges. But they also emphasize how little we actually understand, how much of what we call knowledge is really just comfortable ignorance, how many phenomena exist that we simply ignore because they don't fit our frameworks, don't yield to our methods, don't cooperate with our attempts to measure and categorize and control. The park itself continues unchanged by my observations, continues its cycles of season and weather, continues to attract visitors during open months and empty during closure, continues to be managed according to policies and procedures that assume wilderness is fundamentally comprehensible, fundamentally controllable, fundamentally knowable through proper application of scientific method and administrative oversight. The lights aren't mentioned in any official documentation, aren't included in any management plans, aren't acknowledged in any visitor materials or staff briefings, exist only in scattered ranger reports filed over decades and promptly forgotten or dismissed as misidentifications or atmospheric phenomena or equipment malfunctions. And maybe that's appropriate, maybe some things are better left unacknowledged officially, better left as mysteries encountered by individual rangers during lonely patrols rather than as official phenomena requiring investigation and explanation and incorporation into the park's public identity. Maybe the lights prefer this anonymity, this existence at the margins of awareness, this freedom to continue their journey through closed park without attracting attention or interference from authorities who'd feel obligated to explain them or control them or prevent them if they were officially recognized. I think about the progression I've documented, about the slow movement from southeast to northwest over 8 years of observations, about where that trajectory leads if extended forward into future years. At the current rate, the lights should reach the northwestern boundary of the park in maybe 3 or 4 more years, should arrive at the edge of protected wilderness where park land transitions into national forest and then eventually into private property and developed areas. And I wonder what will happen then, whether they'll stop or continue, whether their journey ends at the park boundary or extends beyond it into landscapes we've already transformed and developed and removed from wilderness designation. Maybe they've been making this journey for decades, for centuries, moving through what's now park land but was once just forest, just mountains, just wilderness without boundaries or names or management plans. Maybe they've been following this route since long before the park existed, since before Europeans arrived, since before even the native tribes who lived here developed their understanding of this place and its features and its presences. Maybe they're as old as the mountains themselves, as fundamental to this landscape as the rivers and the trees and the stone that forms the ridges and valleys they move through. Or maybe they're newer, maybe they appeared in response to something, some change in the landscape or some event that created conditions allowing them to manifest or become visible or cross over from whatever realm they usually inhabit into the one we perceive as physical reality. Maybe the creation of the park itself, the designation of this area as protected wilderness, the reduction of human activity and development, created space for them to move freely, created conditions where they could travel without constant interference, could follow their route during closure seasons when observation was minimal and their passage could proceed relatively undisturbed. I don't know, can't know, can only speculate based on limited observations gathered during brief encounters that reveal tantalizing details but never enough information to construct complete understanding, never enough evidence to move from mystery to explanation, from question to answer, from unknown to known. And maybe that's how it should be, maybe some things are meant to remain mysterious, meant to resist explanation, meant to persist at the boundaries of our understanding as reminders that reality is larger than our categories, more complex than our frameworks, more strange than our comfortable assumptions about how the world works. The other rangers have stopped asking me about the lights, have stopped engaging with my reports beyond the minimum required for administrative purposes, have basically decided to treat my observations as personal eccentricity rather than as legitimate phenomena requiring investigation or response. They're polite about it, don't mock me or exclude me from normal station activities, don't treat me as unstable or unreliable, just quietly dismiss anything I say about lights or radio interference or unusual experiences during closure season patrols, filing it away under the category of things that don't require attention or action or serious consideration. And I understand their position, understand that from their perspective I'm the ranger who's become too isolated, who's spent too many winters alone, who's started seeing significance in things that probably have mundane explanations, who's constructed elaborate interpretations of experiences that are probably just routine encounters with natural phenomena misperceived due to darkness and cold and the psychological effects of prolonged solitude. They're not wrong to be skeptical, not wrong to doubt, not wrong to maintain professional distance from my obsession with something they've never observed and have no reason to believe exists beyond my reports. But I know what I've seen, know what I've experienced, know that those 3 hours in March when I crossed the threshold and observed the lights directly were real, were genuine, were encounters with something that exists independent of my perception even if it defies easy explanation or comfortable categorization. And I know I'll see them again next winter, know they'll appear again during closure season, know they'll continue their journey through the park regardless of whether anyone believes in them or investigates them or tries to understand them. I've been preparing for next winter already, even though it's still months away, even though the park is currently full of summer visitors and my duties focus on the ordinary business of managing crowds and maintaining facilities and responding to the constant stream of minor emergencies and questions and situations that constitute summer ranger work. I've been improving my equipment, acquiring better optics and more reliable GPS units and backup batteries and all the technological tools that might help me document the lights more effectively next time I encounter them, even though previous attempts at documentation have failed and there's no reason to think future attempts will succeed where past ones haven't. But I need to try, need to keep investigating, need to maintain my role as the ranger who follows these lights even though following them has cost me my marriage and possibly my professional reputation and certainly my peace of mind, has transformed me from someone who was content with ordinary ranger work into someone who's become obsessed with mysteries that resist resolution, who's chosen investigation over comfort, understanding over acceptance, questions over answers. My supervisor called me into his office last week, suggested gently that maybe I should consider transferring to a different park, maybe somewhere with year-round staffing where I wouldn't be spending so many months alone, where the isolation wouldn't be so intense, where my duties would involve more interaction with colleagues and visitors and less solo patrol work in empty backcountry. He said it as a suggestion rather than a directive, said my performance was still acceptable, said there were no formal complaints or concerns, just a sense that maybe a change would be good for me, might help me find better balance, might allow me to move past whatever it was I'd gotten stuck on during these past years. I thanked him for the suggestion, told him I'd think about it, didn't commit to anything but also didn't refuse outright. And I have thought about it, have considered whether leaving might be the right choice, whether staying is healthy or productive or sustainable, whether I'm serving any useful purpose by remaining here or whether I'm just feeding an obsession that's already taken too much from me, already cost me too much in terms of relationships and normalcy and the ordinary life I might have had if I'd never seen those lights, never started following them, never crossed that threshold into experiences that changed how I understand reality and wilderness and the boundaries between known and unknown. But I can't leave, can't abandon the investigation now, can't walk away from 8 years of documentation and observation and all the questions that remain unanswered, all the patterns that remain unexplained, all the mysteries that persist in this park whether I'm here witnessing them or not. The lights will continue their journey with or without me, but if I leave, who will document them? Who will maintain awareness of their presence? Who will serve as the witness to phenomena that exist at the margins of acknowledgement, that persist in the spaces between official recognition and complete dismissal? So I'll stay, at least through next closure season, at least until I have another opportunity to observe the lights, to follow them, to try once more to understand what they are and where they're going and what their presence means. And maybe after that I'll be ready to leave, Maybe after one more winter of observations I'll have gathered enough information to feel like I've completed whatever task I've somehow taken on, whatever responsibility I've accepted by being the ranger who happens to be present and paying attention when these lights appear. Or maybe I'll never be ready to leave. Maybe I'll spend the rest of my career here following lights through closed park, documenting phenomena that no one else takes seriously, serving as the lone witness to mysteries that will never be officially acknowledged or investigated or explained. Maybe that's my purpose now, maybe that's what I've become, the park ranger who follows lights in closed national park, who maintains his vigil during empty winters, who persists in investigation despite skepticism and isolation and all the costs that come with choosing mystery over certainty, questions over answers, the unknown over the comfortable illusions of complete understanding. The summer crowds will eventually thin, the season will change, the first snows will fall on the high peaks, and the park will prepare for closure, for the annual emptying that transforms it from recreational facility back into wilderness, from managed landscape back into something closer to its true nature. The gates will be locked, the facilities shuttered, the visitors excluded, and the park will belong once again to itself and the animals and the weather and whatever else inhabits it during those months when human presence becomes minimal, when the boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary become more permeable, when things that remain hidden during busy seasons reveal themselves to those who are present and paying attention. And somewhere in the northern section, probably in late December or early January, the lights will appear again, will resume their slow progression toward the northwestern boundary, will continue the journey they've been making for however long they've been making it, following routes that predate our maps, serving purposes we may never comprehend, existing according to rules we don't understand in spaces that overlap with but aren't quite the same as the wilderness we think we're managing and protecting and preserving for future generations. I'll be there watching for them, waiting for them, ready to follow them once more through the darkness and the snow and the absolute silence of closure season, ready to document their appearance and their movement and whatever details I can observe before they disappear or before my radio fails or before I cross whatever threshold separates ordinary observation from direct encounter. Ready to serve my role as witness, as documenter, as the ranger who sees what others miss, who pays attention when attention is scarce, who maintains awareness of presences that exist whether acknowledged or not, whether explained or not, whether believed or not. That's who I am now, that's what I've become, the park ranger who follows lights in a closed national park, who has sacrificed normalcy for investigation, who has chosen mystery over comfort, who lives alone with his questions and his documentation and his certainty that wilderness contains more than we usually acknowledge, more than our frameworks encompass, more than our management can control or our understanding can explain. And when next winter comes, when closure season arrives, when the lights appear again moving through empty park toward destinations unknown, I'll be there following them, documenting them, witnessing them, serving the purpose I've somehow accepted even though it's cost me everything, even though it's left me isolated and divorced and possibly considered unstable by colleagues who've stopped taking my observations seriously. Because someone needs to witness these lights, someone needs to maintain awareness of their presence, someone needs to document their journey through this park that holds mysteries we've barely begun to acknowledge, let alone understand. And for now, for however long I remain here, for however many more closure seasons I'm able to patrol these empty forests, that someone is me. I've been working as a park ranger at Blackwood National Park for 12 years now, most of that time assigned to the remote northern section where visitors are sparse even during peak season and where the terrain gets rough enough that most people prefer the easier trails in the southern part near the main visitor center. I don't mind the isolation, never have, Find something peaceful about being alone in wilderness areas that see maybe a dozen visitors a week during summer and sometimes go entire months without a single hiker during winter when the park officially closes to public access due to snow and road conditions and the general impracticality of maintaining facilities and services when so few people want to use them. The park closes every year from December 1st through March 31st, a complete closure except for ranger patrols and essential maintenance, all the access roads gated and locked, all the facilities shuttered, all the campgrounds and trailheads and parking areas emptied of the cars and RVs and tents that fill them during warmer months. During closure season we maintain a skeleton crew, just 3 rangers covering the entire 40,000-acre park, doing periodic patrols to check for illegal access, monitor wildlife, assess winter damage to infrastructure, basically just keeping an eye on things during the months when the park belongs entirely to itself and the animals and the weather, when human presence becomes the exception rather than the rule. I prefer closure season, have always preferred it, find the work more satisfying when you're not constantly dealing with visitor issues, not answering the same questions repeatedly, not enforcing regulations that seem to offend people who think paying an entrance fee entitles them to do whatever they want regardless of posted rules or ecological concerns or basic common sense about how to behave in wilderness areas. During closure the park feels more honest somehow, more like what it actually is rather than what we pretend it is for public consumption, more like wilderness and less like outdoor recreation facility, more like a place with its own logic and patterns and purposes that have nothing to do with human entertainment or convenience. The lights started appearing during my second closure season, 8 years ago now, though I didn't think much of them at first, didn't recognize them as unusual or worthy of particular attention or investigation. I was doing a routine evening patrol in mid-January, driving slowly along the main park road checking for fallen trees or other hazards, when I noticed a light in the distance, maybe a mile or 2 off the road up in the higher elevations, a pale steady glow that stood out against the darkness of the forest and the snow-covered slopes. My first assumption was that it was someone with a flashlight or lantern, illegal visitors who'd bypassed the locked gates and were camping in the closed park, something that happened occasionally despite our best efforts to prevent it, people who either didn't know about the closure or didn't care, who wanted the backcountry experience without the crowds and regulations of open season. I noted the location, marked it on my patrol log, planned to hike up there the next day to check it out, to find whoever was camping illegally and escort them out of the park and possibly issue citations depending on their attitude and whether they'd caused any damage or violated regulations beyond simple trespassing. But when I returned the next morning, when I hiked up to the location where I'd seen the light, I found nothing, no campsite, no fire ring, no footprints in the snow except animal tracks, no evidence of human presence at all, just undisturbed forest and the ordinary accumulation of snow and ice and fallen branches that you'd expect to find in wilderness during winter. I assumed I'd miscalculated the location, that the light had been somewhere else and I'd misjudged the distance or direction in the darkness, that it had been further away or at a different angle than I'd thought and I'd simply hiked to the wrong spot. It happens, especially at night when perspective gets distorted and distances become difficult to judge accurately, when a light that seems close might actually be miles away or a light that seems far might be just beyond the next ridge. I made a note to pay more attention if I saw it again, to be more careful about marking the exact location, to bring better equipment for triangulating position in darkness. And I did see it again, about a week later. Same general area but definitely a different specific location, the light appearing in early evening as I was finishing a patrol, that same pale steady glow that seemed too bright and too constant to be a campfire, that looked more like electric light or lantern light, artificial illumination rather than natural flame. This time I tried to approach it immediately, turned off the main road onto a service track that led in that direction, drove as far as the snow would allow and then continued on foot, hiking through knee-deep snow toward where the light should be. But as I got closer, maybe within a quarter mile of what I estimated was its location, my radio stopped working. Not gradually, not fading out as sometimes happens when you're in valleys or behind ridges that block signals, but suddenly and completely, just dead silence where there should have been the normal background static and occasional transmissions from the other rangers or dispatch. I checked the battery, checked the frequency, checked all the basic troubleshooting steps we're trained to do when equipment malfunctions, but everything seemed fine, everything showed as operational. The radio just wasn't receiving or transmitting for no apparent reason. I continued hiking toward the light, figuring I'd check out whatever was causing it and then deal with the radio issue afterward. Maybe the cold had affected it in some way I didn't understand, maybe there was ice buildup somewhere affecting the antenna, maybe it was just coincidental equipment failure that happened to occur at this particular moment. But as I got closer to where the light should be, as I topped a ridge that should have given me a clear view of the area where I'd seen it from the road, the light vanished, just disappeared instantly as if someone had switched it off or as if it had never been there at all. I stood there in the darkness with my dead radio and my flashlight illuminating nothing but trees and snow, trying to understand what had happened, trying to find some explanation that made sense within normal frameworks of understanding. Maybe whoever had been there had seen me coming and extinguished their light and hidden, I thought. Maybe they were watching me right now from concealment, waiting for me to leave so they could continue whatever they were doing. I called out, identifying myself as a ranger, announcing that the park was closed and anyone present was trespassing and needed to come out and identify themselves. No response except the small sounds of forest at night, wind moving through trees, snow falling from branches, the distant call of an owl somewhere in the darkness. I searched the area as thoroughly as I could given the conditions, looking for footprints or campsite or any indication of human presence, but found nothing, just pristine snow unmarked except by animal tracks, just undisturbed forest showing no signs that anyone had been here recently or was here now. I hiked back to my truck, and as soon as I was maybe a half-mile from where the light had been, my radio started working again, just suddenly came back to life with the normal background static and occasional transmissions, as if whatever had been blocking it had stopped or I'd moved outside its range of effect. I reported the incident when I got back to the ranger station, told the other rangers about the light and the radio failure and the lack of any physical evidence at the location, and they looked at me the way people look at someone who's telling a story they don't quite believe but don't want to directly challenge. One of them suggested it might have been a helicopter, maybe a medical flight or military exercise, something that would account for bright artificial light and would be gone by the time I hiked close enough to see it. The other suggested atmospheric phenomena, temperature inversions, or ice crystals creating optical effects, natural explanations for lights that appear and disappear in ways that seem unusual but are actually just physics and meteorology behaving in complex ways. Both were reasonable suggestions, both were possible explanations, but neither quite fit what I'd experienced, neither accounted for the radio failure or the complete absence of any evidence or the particular quality of the light that hadn't looked like a helicopter or an atmospheric phenomenon but had looked like artificial illumination, like lantern light or floodlight, like something deliberately placed rather than naturally occurring. But I accepted their explanations, or at least didn't argue with them, didn't want to seem like I was insisting on mysterious or paranormal interpretations when there were probably mundane answers I just wasn't knowledgeable enough to recognize. I filed my report, documented what I'd observed, and went back to my regular patrol duties, figuring the whole thing would either explain itself eventually or would just be one of those odd incidents that you remember but never fully understand, that you file away as unexplained but not necessarily significant. Except it kept happening, kept recurring throughout that winter and the next winter and every winter since, the lights appearing maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, always at night, always in the remote northern section of the park where I did most of my patrols, always that same pale steady glow that looked like artificial illumination, always disappearing when I got close, always accompanied by radio failure that started at roughly the same distance, maybe a quarter to a half mile from wherever the light was positioned. I started documenting more carefully, started mapping each occurrence, noting the date and time and exact location and weather conditions and any other details that might be relevant. Over the course of those 8 years I've logged maybe 60 or 70 sightings, have seen the lights in dozens of different locations spread across the northern section of the park, in valleys and on ridges, near streams and in dense forest, in areas with trails and in areas where there are no trails, no pattern that I could identify except that they only appeared during closure season when the park was completely empty of visitors, when no one except rangers should have been present. And I started investigating more systematically, started approaching the lights with better equipment, with backup batteries for my radio, with GPS units to mark exact locations, with cameras to try to photograph them before they disappeared, with night vision equipment to see if I could spot whoever or whatever was creating them. But every attempt ended the same way, the radio failing at a consistent distance, the light vanishing before I could get close enough to see its source clearly, no physical evidence left behind, no footprints or equipment or any indication of what had created the illumination. The radio failure was the most disturbing aspect, the most consistent and most inexplicable part of the pattern. It happened every single time, always at approximately the same distance from the light, always sudden and complete rather than gradual degradation, and always temporary, resolving as soon as I moved away from the area where the light had been. I had the radio checked multiple times, had it serviced and tested and eventually replaced with a new unit, but the problem persisted, suggesting it wasn't equipment malfunction but rather something about the location or the light itself or some interaction between them that interfered with radio transmission in ways I didn't understand. I researched radio interference, read about electromagnetic phenomena, learned about solar flares and geomagnetic storms and ionospheric conditions that can affect radio propagation, but none of it quite explained what I was experiencing. None of it accounted for interference that was so localized and so consistent, that occurred in the same way every time I approached these lights regardless of solar activity or atmospheric conditions or any of the other factors that supposedly influence radio communication. I started wondering whether I should report this more formally, whether I should escalate beyond just filing routine patrol reports, whether there was some agency or organization that investigates unexplained phenomena in national parks or studies unusual lights or deals with whatever category this fell into. But I also worried about seeming unstable or unreliable, worried about my supervisors questioning my fitness for duty, worried about becoming known as the ranger who sees mysterious lights and believes in things that can't be explained through normal means, the ranger who maybe spends too much time alone in winter, who maybe isn't handling the isolation as well as he claims, who maybe needs to be reassigned to duties that involve more human contact and less solo patrol work in empty wilderness. So I kept quiet about the extent of my observations, kept filing basic reports that documented the lights without emphasizing the pattern or the consistency or the strange details that made them seem significant rather than just occasional odd sightings. And I kept investigating on my own, kept approaching the lights whenever I saw them, kept trying to get close enough to see their source clearly, to photograph them adequately, to understand what they were and why they appeared and why they affected my radio and why they only appeared during closure season when the park was empty. After 3 or 4 years of this, after dozens of sightings and failed attempts to reach them, I started to notice something else, something about the locations that took time to recognize because it wasn't obvious from any individual sighting but became apparent when I looked at all of them together, when I plotted them on a map and studied the pattern they created. The lights appeared to be moving in a specific direction, slowly, over time, following a route that went generally north-northwest through the park, as if whoever or whatever was creating them was traveling, was making their way somewhere, was using the park as a passage rather than a destination. If you looked at just one winter's sightings, there was no clear pattern, just scattered locations across the northern section. But if you looked at all 8 years together, if you plotted every sighting chronologically and connected them in sequence, you could see a gradual progression, a slow movement from the southeastern part of my patrol area toward the northwestern boundary, maybe a mile or two of progress each winter, as if something was moving through the park at a very deliberate pace, taking months to cover distances that could be hiked in days, stopping frequently, moving only at night, producing these lights for reasons I couldn't determine. This realization changed how I thought about the lights, changed them from isolated phenomena to components of something larger, something ongoing, something with purpose and direction even if I didn't understand what that purpose was or where it was leading. I started thinking about them less as random occurrences to be explained and more as markers of some kind of journey, some kind of transit through the park that happened during closure season when observation was minimal and interference was unlikely. I became somewhat obsessed with them, I'll admit that, started structuring my patrols around trying to intercept them, around positioning myself in locations where they might appear based on the historical pattern, around trying to anticipate their next appearance so I could be closer from the start, so I wouldn't have to approach from a distance and trigger whatever it was that caused them to disappear. I started spending more time in the park during closure season than strictly necessary for my duties, volunteering for extra patrol shifts, taking longer routes, staying out later into the evenings when the lights most commonly appeared. My wife noticed the change, commented on how I seemed distracted, how I was spending more time at work and less time at home, how I seemed preoccupied with something I wasn't sharing with her. I tried to explain about the lights, tried to describe what I'd been seeing and investigating, but I could tell she thought I was making too much of what were probably just mundane phenomena I didn't understand, probably just other rangers or maintenance workers or scientists doing research, probably just ordinary activities that seemed mysterious only because I encountered them in unexpected contexts. She was probably right to be skeptical, probably right to think I was overthinking what might have simple explanations, probably right to worry that I was becoming too isolated, too caught up in something that didn't warrant the attention I was giving it. But I couldn't stop, couldn't let go of the mystery, couldn't accept simple explanations that didn't account for all the details, didn't explain the radio failure or the vanishing or the pattern of movement or the fact that they only appeared during closure season when the park was supposedly empty. Last winter, during my most recent closure season, I decided I needed to try a different approach, needed to stop attempting to reach the lights and instead try to understand them from a distance, to observe without interfering, to gather data without triggering whatever response caused them to disappear and my radio to fail. I started bringing better optics, started positioning myself at elevated locations with clear views of valleys where the lights often appeared, started watching them for longer periods without approaching, trying to see whether they moved or changed or displayed any characteristics that might reveal their nature. And I saw something I hadn't seen before, something that had been impossible to notice when I was always approaching and always losing radio contact and always having the lights disappear before I could study them properly. The lights weren't static, weren't just glowing steadily in one position, but were actually moving slowly, very slowly, maybe a few feet per minute, progressing through the forest in a deliberate way that suggested intention and purpose, that looked like someone or something carrying a light source and walking carefully through difficult terrain. I watched one particular light for over an hour one night in February, watched it move maybe 100 yards during that time, watched it navigate around trees and over small ridges, watched it maintain a consistent height above the ground that suggested it was being carried rather than floating or flying, watched it display all the characteristics of ordinary human activity, of someone hiking with a powerful lamp or lantern, moving through closed park at night for reasons I couldn't determine. But when I tried to approach, when I finally decided I needed to get closer despite my previous failures, the same thing happened as always. My radio failed at about a quarter-mile distance, and the light disappeared before I could close to within visual range that would let me see who or what was carrying it. I searched the area afterward, as always, and found nothing, as always, no footprints in the snow, no evidence of passage, no indication that anyone had been there. This was when I started seriously considering the possibility that these weren't humans, that whatever was creating these lights and moving through the closed park wasn't hikers or researchers or any kind of ordinary visitors, that it might be something else entirely, something that existed in the park but wasn't part of the normal animal populations or human presence. Something that only appeared during closure season because that was when the park was empty enough for it to move freely, without being observed or confronted by the constant stream of visitors who filled the trails during open season. I know how that sounds. No, it seems like I've crossed a line from rational investigation into speculation about things that don't exist, that can't exist according to our normal understanding of what's possible. But I've been a ranger for 12 years, have spent thousands of hours alone in wilderness, have seen and experienced enough to know that forests contain complexities we don't fully understand, contain animal behaviors and natural phenomena that can seem inexplicable until you learn more about them, contain mysteries that sometimes resolve into simple explanations and sometimes remain mysterious despite investigation. And these lights, these 8 years of consistent sightings following a clear pattern through closed park, affecting radio equipment in reproducible ways, leaving no physical evidence despite appearing to be the result of deliberate movement and intentional activity, these fell into the category of things that remained mysterious despite investigation, that didn't resolve into simple explanations no matter how much I observed or documented or tried to approach. A few weeks ago, near the end of this most recent closure season, I had what I think might be the most significant encounter yet, the observation that comes closest to revealing something about the true nature of these lights even though it raised more questions than it answered. I was doing a late evening patrol in mid-March, just 2 weeks before the park was scheduled to reopen for the season, when I saw not one light but 3 lights, all in the same general area, all that same pale steady glow, all moving slowly through the forest in what appeared to be a coordinated way, maintaining consistent distances from each other, proceeding in the same direction at the same pace. I watched them from a distance for as long as I could, maybe 30 or 40 minutes, watching them navigate through dense forest, watching them move over terrain that would be challenging even in daylight, watching them display coordination and purpose that seemed to indicate communication or at least mutual awareness, as if they were traveling together rather than just coincidentally occupying the same area at the same time. And then I made a decision that was probably foolish, probably violated my better judgment and my training and my awareness of all my previous failed attempts, but that felt necessary in that moment, felt like the only way I might finally understand what I'd been observing for 8 years. I decided to approach all 3 lights simultaneously, to position myself between them so I couldn't be avoiding, to force some kind of encounter or confrontation or at least close observation that would reveal their nature. I hiked quickly toward the center point between the 3 lights, moving as fast as the snow conditions allowed, trying to reach that position before they moved too far, before they adjusted their routes or disappeared as they always did when I approached. My radio failed when I was maybe a half-mile from the nearest light, right on schedule, right at the distance where it always failed, but I kept going, kept pushing toward that center point, kept watching the lights ahead of me and beside me, trying to judge distances and angles in the darkness. And as I got closer, as I reached what should have been within visual range, within the distance where I should have been able to see the source of the lights with my own eyes rather than just seeing the glow they created, something strange happened, something I don't have adequate vocabulary to describe properly, something that felt like passing through a boundary or crossing a threshold. Like moving from one kind of space into a different kind of space even though the physical terrain remained unchanged. The quality of the darkness changed, became somehow both darker and clearer simultaneously, as if I could see less but understand more, as if perception itself was operating differently. The cold intensified, became more penetrating, more present, not just physical temperature but something else, some quality of cold that went deeper than skin and muscle, that felt like it reached something more fundamental than body. And the silence became absolute, more complete than the normal quiet of winter forest, more like the absence of sound than just the absence of noise, as if I'd moved into a space where sound itself didn't quite function the same way. I could still see the three lights, could see them more clearly now actually, could distinguish details I hadn't been able to see from farther away. They weren't carried by visible figures, weren't held by hands or attached to bodies, weren't lanterns or flashlights or any kind of technology one recognized. They were just light, just luminescence, just glowing presence that moved through the forest as if it had substance and intention but no physical form, as if light itself had become animate, had become capable of directed movement and purposeful activity. I stood there frozen, not from fear exactly but from a kind of overwhelmed incomprehension, from encountering something so far outside my framework of understanding that I had no categories for processing it, no mental structures for making sense of what I was seeing. The three lights continued their movement, continued their slow progression through the forest, passing maybe 20 or 30 feet from where I stood, close enough that I should have been able to reach out and touch them if they'd been physical objects, close enough that their glow illuminated the snow and the trees around me in that same pale steady light I'd been seeing from a distance for 8 years. And as they passed, as I stood there watching them move through space that felt simultaneously normal and profoundly strange, I had the overwhelming sense that they were aware of me, that they knew I was there observing them, that they'd chosen to allow this encounter, to permit this observation, that my 8 years of following them and documenting them and trying to understand them had finally led to this moment where the boundary between observation and encounter had become permeable enough for direct experience rather than just distant sighting. I don't know how long I stood there, how long I watched them move through that strange space where darkness and cold and silence all felt different from their normal qualities, where the forest itself seemed to be something other than just trees and snow and the ordinary features of wilderness landscape. Time felt unreliable, felt like it might have been minutes or hours, felt like measurement itself wasn't quite applicable to what I was experiencing. Eventually the lights moved on, moved beyond my position, continued their slow progress toward whatever destination they were approaching, and the boundary I'd crossed, the threshold I'd passed through, seemed to dissolve or release me, seemed to return me to normal space and normal time and normal physical reality. The darkness resumed its ordinary quality, the cold became just temperature again, the silence became just the normal quiet of winter night rather than something more absolute and more strange. My radio started working immediately, suddenly receiving transmissions again, the other ranger calling for me, asking my position, saying I'd been out of contact for over 3 hours, saying they'd been about to initiate a search because I'd missed my scheduled check-in and wasn't responding to repeated calls. 3 hours. I'd thought maybe 30 minutes had passed, maybe an hour at most, but my watch confirmed what the other ranger was saying, confirmed that 3 hours had somehow elapsed during what felt like a much shorter period, confirmed that time itself had been operating differently in whatever space I'd entered when I'd approached those lights. I returned to the ranger station and filed my report, documented what I'd experienced as accurately as I could, tried to describe the lights and the strange qualities of the space I'd entered and the sense of being observed or acknowledged by something that had awareness but no discernible physical form. The other rangers read my report with expressions that were carefully neutral, that betrayed neither belief nor skepticism but that clearly indicated concern, that suggested they thought maybe the isolation had finally gotten to me, maybe the long winters alone had created perceptual problems, maybe I needed evaluation or reassignment or at minimum a break from solo patrol work in empty wilderness. I understood their concern, understood that my report sounded like exactly the kind of thing someone experiencing psychological problems might report, might experience, or believe they experienced or construct from ambiguous stimuli when spending too much time alone. But I also knew what I'd seen, knew what I'd experienced, knew that those 3 hours had passed and my radio had failed and I'd entered some kind of space that didn't follow normal rules, where lights moved with intention through closed park, where something existed that we didn't have names for or categories for or any framework for understanding. The park reopened 2 weeks ago for the new season, reopened for visitors and normal operations and the busy months when trails fill with hikers and campgrounds fill with families and the ranger station fills with people asking questions and reporting problems and generally engaging with the park as a recreational facility rather than as wilderness. The lights haven't appeared since reopening, haven't been visible since that last encounter in March, exactly as the pattern predicted, exactly as 8 years of observation suggested, appearing only during closure season when the park is empty and they can move through it without observation or interference. I'm still working as a ranger, still assigned to the northern section, still doing my patrols and my duties and maintaining my professional performance at levels that apparently satisfy my supervisors despite their concerns about my last report. But I'm waiting for next winter, waiting for next closure season, waiting to see if the lights will appear again, if they'll continue their slow progression through the park, if I'll have another opportunity to observe them or encounter them or understand something more about what they are and why they move through closed park during winter months when no one else is present to see them.
The parking garage security guard after midnight. I've been working as a night security guard at the Central Avenue parking garage for 7 years now, sitting in a small booth on the ground floor watching monitors that show feeds from 32 cameras positioned throughout the 6-level structure, monitoring the comings and goings of vehicles and people during the overnight hours when the building is mostly empty, when the daytime rush of office workers and shoppers has dwindled to just occasional late-night visitors, residents from the apartment building next door, people working third shift at the hospital 2 blocks away, the sparse traffic of a mid-sized city after midnight. It's not demanding work, not physically anyway, mostly just staying awake and paying attention, watching screens that usually show nothing but empty concrete levels and parked cars sitting motionless under fluorescent lights that buzz constantly with that particular frequency that becomes part of the background noise of consciousness, that you stop noticing after the first few weeks on the job. The mental challenge is maintaining alertness during hours when your body wants to sleep, when your circadian rhythms are insisting you should be unconscious and resting, when the monotony of watching unchanging camera feeds threatens to lull you into the kind of zoned-out trance state that makes time pass but also makes you miss things, makes you fail at the basic requirement of the job, which is simply to notice, to observe, to remain aware of what's happening in the building even when nothing appears to be happening. The booth itself is cramped, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with barely enough room for the desk that holds the monitors, the chair I spend most of my shift in, a small filing cabinet for incident reports, and a mini fridge that hums in the corner competing with the fluorescent buzz overhead. There's a coffee maker that I run through 3 or 4 pots a night, the smell of burnt coffee becoming so familiar it's practically a comfort, a marker of routine in the otherwise featureless passage of overnight hours. The booth has one small window that looks out onto the ground-level entrance, though most nights I keep the blind drawn because the glass reflects the monitor glow and makes it harder to see the screens clearly, makes it harder to distinguish between what's happening on the cameras and what's merely reflected in the window separating me from the garage proper. The monitors themselves are older models, probably 8 or 9 years old, the kind with thick bezels and slight color distortion in the corners, arranged in a grid of 4 rows and 8 columns on the wall facing my desk. Each screen cycles through different camera views on a programmed rotation, though I can override the system to focus on specific cameras when something catches my attention or when I'm conducting systematic reviews of particular areas. The image quality is adequate but not exceptional, good enough to identify people and read license plates under optimal conditions, but grainy in low light and prone to motion blur when things move quickly through the frame. I've gotten good at it over the years, developed strategies for staying alert, created routines that break up the long shifts from 11 at night until 7 in the morning, structured my time into patrol rounds and camera reviews and system checks and all the small tasks that fill the hours and keep my mind engaged enough to notice if something unusual occurs, if someone enters who shouldn't be there, if some kind of incident develops that requires response or documentation or notification of police. Most nights nothing happens, nothing beyond the ordinary comings and goings of legitimate users of the facility, people parking and walking to their cars and driving away, the simple transactions that parking garages exist to facilitate. I do physical rounds every hour, walking the entirety of the garage from ground level to level 6 and back down again, checking door locks and elevator function and looking for anything that seems out of place or potentially problematic. These walks take about 25 minutes if I maintain a steady pace, longer if I stop to investigate something or to simply stand in different locations experiencing the garage from ground level rather than through camera mediation. There's something different about being physically present in the space versus watching it on monitors, some quality of atmosphere and acoustic texture that the cameras don't capture, some sense of the building as a living system with its own rhythms and temperatures and subtle variations from level to level, zone to zone. Level 3 is always cooler than the other floors, for reasons the maintenance staff has never adequately explained, some quirk of the HVAC system or the building's orientation or the way air circulates through the structure. Level 5 has a smell, faint but persistent, like old oil and rubber, stronger near the northwest corner where delivery trucks used to park back when the adjacent building had active loading docks, before they relocated those operations and converted the space to additional office suites. Level 2 has the best acoustics, something about the ceiling height and the density of parked cars creating this rich echo that makes footsteps sound almost musical, that transforms the ordinary sounds of movement into something more resonant and strange. But about 3 months ago, I started noticing something that didn't fit the normal patterns, something that caught my attention because it was so precisely consistent, so exactly repetitive, occurring with a regularity that suggested intention rather than coincidence, that made it stand out from the usual random variations of overnight activity. Every night, at exactly 2:17 in the morning, a figure appeared on camera 12, which monitors the northeast corner of level 3, an area that sees relatively little use because it's distant from both the street entrance and the elevator bank, requiring a longer walk than most people prefer when they have the option of parking closer to access points. The figure appeared suddenly, not walking into frame from any direction, not entering through any door or stairwell visible on adjacent cameras, just suddenly present in that corner as if materializing from nothing, as if the camera had blinked and when it opened again someone was standing there who hadn't been there a moment before. The figure stood facing the wall, back to the camera, wearing what looked like a long dark coat or jacket, head covered with a hood or hat that obscured any details that might have helped identify gender or age or any distinguishing characteristics. And then, after approximately 45 seconds, the figure would disappear just as suddenly, would simply cease to be present in the frame, would vanish between one moment and the next without walking away, without moving toward any exit, without any indication of where they'd gone or how they'd left. Just there, and then not there, appearing and disappearing with a precision that seemed deliberate, that suggested this wasn't random behavior or chance occurrence but rather something happening according to schedule, according to pattern, for reasons I couldn't begin to determine. The first few times I saw this, I assumed it was some kind of technical glitch, some artifact of the camera system or the recording software. Some digital ghost created by compression algorithms or frame dropping or whatever technical processes might create the illusion of a person appearing and disappearing when really it was just pixels arranging themselves into patterns that resembled human figures without actually representing real physical presence. I've seen glitches before, seen cameras freeze or loop or display strange artifacts, seen the limitations of digital surveillance systems create images that don't correspond to physical reality. Camera 8 occasionally shows a vertical line of distortion that makes it look like someone standing near the elevator on level 4 when really it's just a processing error. Camera 19 sometimes doubles the image of cars in certain parking spots, creating the illusion that two vehicles occupy the same space, an impossible overlap that reveals itself as technical malfunction rather than violation of physics. Camera 23 went completely dark for 3 days last year before the technical staff realized a wire had come loose in the junction box, leaving that section of level 5 unmonitored until they traced the problem and made the repair. But this was different, was too consistent and too detailed to be just a glitch, too precisely timed and too clearly defined to be just random digital noise coalescing into person-shaped patterns. The figure appeared at exactly 2:17 every single night, appeared in exactly the same location, stood in exactly the same position, remained for approximately the same duration, disappeared in exactly the same manner. And the image quality was good, was clear enough to see details like the texture of the coat fabric and the way the figure's weight shifted slightly during those 45 seconds of standing, small movements that suggested a real person maintaining balance rather than a static image or a frozen frame. I started keeping notes, writing down observations in a spiral notebook I kept in my desk drawer, recording the exact time of appearance and disappearance each night, noting any variations in the figure's posture or position, documenting the weather outside in case atmospheric conditions affected what I was seeing, tracking my own state of alertness and caffeine consumption in case fatigue or overstimulation was creating perceptual distortions. The notebook filled quickly with entries that all said essentially the same thing: appeared 2:17 a.m., disappeared 2:17 and 45 seconds a.m., no variation, no deviation, no change in pattern or presentation. So I started investigating more carefully, started paying closer attention not just to camera 12 but to all the adjacent cameras, to the feeds showing the stairwell doors and the elevator and the entrance ramps and all the other access points that someone would have to use to reach that location on level 3. And I found nothing, no sign of anyone entering the garage who could account for that figure, no person walking through the door from the stairwell, no one exiting the elevator, no vehicle arriving that might have brought someone to that level who then got out and walked to that corner. Camera 9 covers the stairwell door nearest to that northeast corner, shows anyone entering or exiting that access point. I reviewed hours of footage from around 2:17 on multiple nights, watching for any person who might have entered the stairwell, climbed or descended to level 3, walked to that corner to stand facing the wall for 45 seconds before returning to the stairwell and leaving. Nothing. The stairwell door remained closed, undisturbed, showing no activity whatsoever during the relevant time window. Camera 11 monitors the elevator bank on level 3, captures anyone arriving or departing by that route. Same result, same absence of explanation. The elevator didn't stop at level 3 around 2:17 on any of the nights I checked, showed no one exiting onto that floor who could account for the figure appearing in the northeast corner. The elevator ran its normal patterns, stopping at various levels in response to calls from residents and late-shift workers, but never at times that aligned with the appearance on camera 12. Cameras 13 and 14 cover the entrance ramps, which show any vehicle arriving on level 3 during the relevant timeframe. Again nothing, no cars entering that level at times that would explain someone parking and walking to that corner, standing briefly, then returning to their vehicle and leaving. The traffic patterns on those ramps showed the usual sparse overnight activity, occasional arrivals and departures separated by long stretches of stillness, but nothing corresponding to the precise timing of the figure's nightly manifestation. The figure appeared on camera 12 and only on camera 12, existed only during those 45 seconds at 2:17 in the morning, with no visible arrival or departure, no trace on any other camera in the system, no evidence of physical presence beyond that single precise sighting every night. I checked the recordings, reviewed footage from multiple nights, confirmed that the pattern held consistently, that this wasn't something I'd imagined or misperceived during a moment of exhaustion or inattention, that it was documented, was captured by the system, was there in the digital record available for review and verification. I started timing my hourly rounds to coincide with 2:17, started being physically present on level 3 in that northeast corner at the exact moment when the figure appeared on camera 12, thinking that if I was there in person I could observe directly, could see whether someone was actually standing there or whether the camera was somehow generating an image that had no corresponding physical presence. The first night I tried this, I positioned myself about 30 feet from the corner, standing near a concrete support pillar where I could see the area clearly while remaining somewhat concealed, watching the seconds tick toward 2:17 on my phone. The corner remained empty. No one appeared. I stood there watching the physical space while the digital recording presumably captured the figure as it always did, creating a split between mediated observation and direct perception that was deeply unsettling, that suggested the phenomenon existed only for cameras, only in the realm of electronic detection and digital recording, nowhere else. I felt foolish standing there in the empty garage at 2:17 in the morning, watching a corner where nothing was happening while miles of cable and circuits and processing systems registered something I couldn't see, couldn't verify through my own senses, couldn't confirm as real in any way except through the mediation of technology. I tried this several more times over the following weeks, positioned myself in different locations with different sight lines to that corner, even stood exactly where the figure appeared, faced the wall the way it faced the wall, tried to understand what perspective or position or orientation might reveal what the camera saw but my eyes couldn't detect. Nothing changed. The corner remained empty to my direct observation while camera 12 faithfully recorded its nightly visitor, captured the image that appeared nowhere else, that existed only in that specific technological frame, that specific electronic translation of light and shadow into digital information. I reported it to my supervisor after about a week of nightly observations, told him about the figure appearing at the same time in the same location every night, showed him the footage, explained that I couldn't find any sign of how this person was entering or leaving the garage, suggested maybe we should check the area physically, should inspect that corner of level 3 to see if there was something about the location that might explain what I was seeing. He watched the footage with an expression that was difficult to read, something between skepticism and concern, and then told me he'd look into it, would have the maintenance staff check the area, would review the camera system to make sure everything was functioning properly. His name is Dennis, has been working building management for 15 years, has the kind of practical no-nonsense approach to his job that makes him good at dealing with ordinary problems but somewhat limited when confronting situations that fall outside normal categories. He's seen employees get obsessive before, seen security guards and janitors develop fixations on minor anomalies or perceived patterns, seen how overnight shifts can create mental states that generate meaning where maybe none exists. I could tell he was categorizing my report as potentially that kind of situation, potentially a case of isolation and repetitive work creating perceptual distortions that required gentle management rather than investigation. A few days later he told me that maintenance had found nothing unusual in that corner of level 3, no signs of anyone having been there recently, no damage or disturbance or anything that would explain the figure on the camera. And the technical staff had checked camera 12 specifically, had tested its connection and its software and all its components, and found everything functioning normally, no glitches or malfunctions or anything that would account for false images appearing on the feed. He suggested I keep monitoring it, keep documenting if it continued to appear, but he also implied, without quite saying directly, that maybe I was spending too much time staring at screens, maybe the long overnight shifts were creating perceptual problems, maybe I needed to take some time off or adjust my schedule or find ways to stay more alert and less susceptible to seeing patterns that weren't actually significant. The maintenance report sat on Dennis's desk during our conversation, a single sheet of paper with checkboxes and brief notes indicating they'd inspected the area and found no issues. Checked for structural damage, none observed. Checked for evidence of unauthorized access, none found. Checked for graffiti or vandalism, area clean. The technical report was similarly brief, similarly dismissive of the possibility that something genuinely unusual was occurring. Camera 12 function, normal. Video feed quality, normal. No errors detected in system logs. Recommended action, continue monitoring. But the figure kept appearing, kept showing up at exactly 2:17 every single night, kept standing in that corner facing the wall for 45 seconds before vanishing, kept existing only on that one camera with no corresponding presence on any other feed, no evidence of physical arrival or departure, no explanation that made sense within normal frameworks of understanding how parking garages work, how surveillance systems function, how people move through physical space constrained by doors and walls and the basic architecture of multi-level structures. I started timing it more precisely, started noting the exact second when the figure appeared and the exact second when it disappeared, started documenting every detail I could observe about the appearance, the posture, the small movements, the way the coat fabric seemed to move slightly as if affected by air currents even though level 3 was enclosed and climate controlled and shouldn't have had significant air movement. And I started expanding my investigation, started researching the history of the garage, looking for any incidents that might have occurred in that location, any accidents or deaths or significant events that might explain why that specific corner at that specific time might be significant, might be the focus of this nightly appearance. The garage had been built in 1987, had been operating continuously since then as a commercial parking facility, had changed ownership 3 times over the decades but had maintained essentially the same structure and function throughout, had never undergone major renovation or reconstruction beyond routine maintenance and repairs. The original owner was a local real estate development company that built several similar structures throughout the downtown area during the building boom of the mid-80s. They sold it in 1995 to a regional parking management firm that operated it for 12 years before selling to the current owners, a national company that manages parking facilities in 17 states. I searched through old newspaper archives online, looking for any articles mentioning the garage, any reports of incidents or accidents, finding mostly just routine business news, announcements of rate changes, occasional mentions in crime reports when cars had been broken into or stolen from the facility. There were 3 reported thefts in 1991, 2 in 1996, 1 in 2003, all of them ordinary property crimes with no particular connection to Level 3 or the northeast corner or anything that might explain a recurring manifestation 30 years later. But I did find one article from 1993, a brief piece about a man who died in the garage, found dead in his car on Level 3 by maintenance staff doing early morning rounds. The article said the death appeared to be natural causes, likely a heart attack or similar medical emergency, said the man had been an accountant working late hours during tax season, had apparently died while sitting in his parked car sometime during the night, though the exact time of death wasn't specified. The article gave his name and age, Robert Chenoweth, 41 years old, mentioned he'd left behind a wife and 2 children, expressed condolences from the building management, and that was all, just a brief acknowledgement of a sad but not particularly unusual occurrence, someone dying alone in a parking garage in the middle of the night. The article was dated April 3, 1993, which meant the death had occurred on April 2 or possibly late on April 1, right in the middle of tax season when accountants work crushing hours, when the pressure and stress and long days create conditions for heart attacks and stress-related health emergencies, when people push themselves past reasonable limits trying to meet deadlines and fulfill professional obligations. The article included a small photo, a professional headshot that showed a man with receding hair and glasses, wearing a suit and tie, smiling the kind of smile people make for business photos, pleasant but not revealing much about actual personality or interior life. I tried to find more information about Robert Chenoweth, searched for obituaries or follow-up articles, found very little, just confirmation that he'd been buried at Riverside Cemetery on the south side of town and that his family had apparently moved away from the area a few years after his death. There was an obituary in the local paper, longer than the news article, listing his survivors: wife Patricia, daughter Emily age 9, son Michael age 6, and his professional affiliations, his membership in the State Accounting Association, his volunteer work with a local youth sports league. The obituary mentioned he'd graduated from the state university with a degree in accounting, had worked for the same firm for 18 years, had been described by colleagues as dedicated and meticulous, someone who took his responsibilities seriously, who could be counted on to handle complex tax situations with care and precision. It mentioned he enjoyed fishing and reading historical fiction, that he'd coached his son's Little League team, that he'd been planning a family vacation to the Grand Canyon that summer, a trip they'd been saving for and looking forward to, a trip that would never happen. I couldn't find any indication of exactly where on Level 3 his car had been parked when he'd been found, couldn't confirm whether the northeast corner where the figure appeared was the same location, couldn't establish any definitive connection between this death 30 years ago and the nightly appearance I was observing now. But it seemed like too much of a coincidence to ignore, seemed like the only unusual incident in the garage's history that might possibly explain why someone or something would appear repeatedly in the same location at the same time every night, would stand facing the wall as if waiting or watching or maintaining some kind of vigil, would exist in that liminal way between presence and absence, between documented and unexplained, between physical reality and whatever other kind of reality might intersect with it under certain conditions. I found the maintenance logs from April 1993 in the building's archived records, stored in cardboard boxes in a basement storage room that smelled like mildew and old paper. The logs were handwritten in a ledger book, entries in different hands as various maintenance staff recorded their daily rounds and tasks and observations. The entry for April 2, 1993, was brief and matter-of-fact: found deceased male in vehicle, space 3 to 47, approximate 6:45 a.m. Notified police. Area secured pending investigation. Space 3 to 47. I looked up the garage's space numbering system in the current facilities map, traced the numbers through level 3, found that space 3 to 47 was located in the northeast corner, exactly where camera 12 pointed, exactly where the figure appeared every night at 2:17. The coincidence was too precise to dismiss, too exact to ignore, too clearly linked to be anything other than meaningful, though what that meaning was remained unclear, remained something I could sense but not articulate, could recognize but not explain. I started thinking about the figure differently after finding that article and that maintenance log entry, started considering it less as a security issue requiring response and more as a phenomenon requiring understanding, started wondering what it meant that Robert Chenoweth, who died here 30 years ago, might still be present in some way, might still be manifesting at a specific time in a specific location for reasons I couldn't determine but that presumably had significance to whatever consciousness or awareness or residual energy was creating the appearance. I calculated the timing, tried to determine what 2:17 in the morning might have meant to him, why that specific time might be the moment of his return, the point at which he manifested. If he'd died of a heart attack while sitting in his car during tax season, he might have been working late, might have returned to the garage exhausted after long hours at the office, might have sat in his car for a moment before driving home, might have experienced the cardiac event right there in space 3 to 47 sometime around 2 in the morning, might have spent his final moments alone in that corner, consciousness fading while his family slept at home expecting him to return any minute, never knowing he was already gone. 2:17 could have been the moment of death, the exact second when his heart stopped or his brain ceased functioning, the final point of consciousness that somehow imprinted itself so strongly on that location that it continued to manifest decades later, continued to mark that moment with a kind of temporal echo, a recurring notation that something significant had happened there, that a life had ended there, that the boundary between existence and non-existence had been crossed there at that specific time. The other security guards who worked different shifts started hearing about my observations, started asking me about the figure on camera 12, some of them curious and wanting to see the footage, some of them skeptical and suggesting I was either mistaken or making things up, some of them uncomfortable and preferring not to think about the possibility that the garage might be haunted or might contain presences that existed outside normal physical reality. I showed the footage to anyone who wanted to see it, pointed out the consistency of the appearances, the precision of the timing, the lack of any explanation for how someone could appear and disappear without using any visible access points. Marcus, who worked the evening shift before mine, watched the footage with his arms crossed, his expression skeptical throughout. He suggested maybe someone had found a way to hack the camera system, to inject pre-recorded footage into the live feed as some kind of elaborate prank, though he couldn't explain why anyone would bother or how they could maintain it so consistently or what they would gain from creating fake ghost footage in a parking garage security system. His theory didn't account for the precision of the timing or the way the figure appeared in perfect synchronization with the garage's actual temporal flow, not lagging or jumping or showing any of the artifacts you'd expect from inserted footage. Jennifer, who covered weekend days, was more receptive, told me she'd experienced strange things in other buildings where she'd worked security, places where the overnight environment seemed to create conditions for unusual phenomena, where the absence of normal human activity allowed other presences to become apparent. She told me about a hospital where she'd worked where nurses regularly reported seeing a woman in outdated clothing walking the hallways of a wing that had been closed for renovation, about an office building where the elevator would sometimes open on empty floors with no one having called it, as if responding to requests from people who weren't there, who existed in some other layer of reality that occasionally intersected with the physical world we navigate. Most of them found it unsettling, found something disturbing about the figure standing motionless facing that wall, about the way it appeared and disappeared without transition, about the implication that something was happening in the garage every night that didn't follow normal rules, that existed in a space between security camera documentation and physical verification, between digital record and tangible presence. A few of them suggested I was taking it too seriously, suggested there was probably a simple explanation I just hadn't found yet, suggested maybe I should stop obsessing over it and just do my job monitoring for actual security issues rather than fixating on what was probably just a weird quirk of the camera system. Terry, who'd been doing security work for 25 years and had the weathered cynicism of someone who'd seen too much human foolishness, suggested I was overthinking it, that weird shit happens in buildings sometimes and there's no point trying to figure it all out, that my job was to watch for thieves and vandals and actual threats, not to solve mysteries or investigate phenomena that didn't affect the basic function of the facility. He'd developed a kind of protective numbness over his years of overnight work, a deliberate disengagement from anything that wasn't directly relevant to his immediate responsibilities, a refusal to invest emotional or intellectual energy in things that didn't matter to the simple transaction of trading time for wages. But I couldn't stop paying attention to it, couldn't ignore something that happened with such remarkable consistency, couldn't dismiss it as unimportant when it represented the only truly unusual thing that had happened during my 7 years working overnight in this garage. So I kept watching, kept documenting, kept waiting every night for 2:17 when the figure would appear, would stand for 45 seconds, would disappear, maintaining its schedule with a precision that seemed to suggest purpose, that seemed to indicate this wasn't random or accidental but rather intentional, deliberate, meaningful in ways I couldn't access or comprehend. I started staying after my shift sometimes, staying until mid-morning just to walk through the garage in daylight, to visit that corner on level 3 and stand where the figure stood, to see if there was anything about the physical location that might provide insight into why it was significant, why someone or something returned there every night at the same specific time. The corner was ordinary, unremarkable, just concrete walls and floor, numbered parking spaces painted in faded yellow lines, fluorescent lights overhead that looked different in daylight filtering through the open sides of the garage, the same basic infrastructure that characterized every other part of the structure. But standing there, I felt something, some quality to the space that was difficult to articulate, some sense of weight or presence or attention that seemed to linger even though nothing visible suggested anything unusual. It wasn't frightening exactly, wasn't threatening or malevolent, just heavy somehow, sad maybe, carrying some emotional residue that had settled into the physical location and remained there, imperceptible most of the time but noticeable if you stood still and paid attention, if you allowed yourself to be receptive to qualities of space that we normally ignore because we're too busy or too distracted or too committed to materialist assumptions about how reality works. The temperature was different there, slightly cooler than the surrounding area even though there was no obvious reason for the variation, no vent or opening or architectural feature that would explain the temperature differential. The acoustics were strange too, sounds seeming to die quickly in that corner, voices and footsteps not echoing the way they did elsewhere on level 3, as if something about the space absorbed sound rather than reflecting it, as if the air itself was denser there, more resistant to vibration and transmission. I started bringing a thermometer on my after-shift visits, started documenting the temperature in that corner compared to other locations on level 3, found a consistent difference of 3 to 4 degrees, the corner always cooler, always maintaining that subtle but measurable deviation from the ambient temperature of the surrounding garage. I couldn't explain it, couldn't find any mechanical or architectural reason for it, couldn't locate any source of cold air or any design feature that would account for the persistent temperature anomaly. I started thinking about Robert Chenoweth more deliberately, started imagining his final moments, the loneliness of dying alone in a parked car in the middle of the night, the fear or confusion or acceptance he might have felt as his heart failed or his brain shut down or whatever physiological process had ended his life in this anonymous location surrounded by concrete and metal and artificial light. I thought about his wife and children learning of his death, thought about them visiting this garage maybe, standing in this corner maybe, trying to understand or accept or make peace with the fact that someone they loved had died here, had spent his final moments in this impersonal commercial space rather than at home surrounded by family. Patricia Chenoweth would have been 38 when her husband died, suddenly a widow with 2 young children, facing all the practical and emotional challenges of unexpected loss. Emily would have been 9, old enough to understand death but young enough that it would have fundamentally shaped her development, would have become part of her identity in ways that people who lose parents in childhood carry forever. Michael at 6 would have fewer memories, would have grown up with a father who was more absence than presence, more idea than actual remembered experience. I wondered if they'd come to the garage afterward, if Patricia had needed to see where it happened, if she'd stood in this spot trying to understand or accept or simply witness the location where her husband's life had ended. I wondered if the children had come too, if Emily and Michael had been brought here to say goodbye, to see the place one last time before moving forward with their changed lives. I wondered if their grief had contributed to whatever weight or presence I felt in this corner, if emotion that intense and raw had somehow marked the space, had left traces that persisted beyond the moments of their immediate experience. And I wondered if that emotional weight, that accumulation of grief and loss and unresolved ending, might have somehow imprinted itself on this location, might have created conditions where something of Robert's presence persisted, where some aspect of his consciousness or identity continued to manifest, where the boundary between then and now remained permeable enough that he could return, could stand here facing the wall at the exact time of his death, could maintain some connection to the physical world even though his body had been buried decades ago and his family had moved away and everyone who'd known him had presumably moved on with their lives. I started reading about grief and trauma and how emotional experiences affect physical spaces, started learning about theories of place memory and environmental imprinting, started discovering that other people throughout history had noticed similar phenomena, had observed that locations where intense emotions were experienced seemed to retain some quality of those experiences, seemed to become charged or marked or changed in ways that persisted over time, that remained detectable to sensitive observation even years or decades after the original events. There were books about haunted houses and battlefields, about how places where people died violently or tragically seemed to maintain connections to those deaths, seemed to replay them or echo them or preserve them in forms that witnesses described as ghosts or apparitions or presences. There were theories about how consciousness might not be entirely contained in brains, might instead be somehow distributed through physical space, might leave traces or impressions that persisted like fossils, like recordings embedded in the fabric of locations where significant experiences occurred. Some researchers talked about stone tape theory, the idea that rocks and buildings could somehow record events and play them back under certain conditions, though no one could explain the mechanism by which this might happen. No one could describe the physics or chemistry that would allow stone and concrete to capture and preserve and replay human experiences. Other researchers focused on electromagnetic fields, suggested that consciousness might interact with or create patterns in ambient electrical activity, that these patterns might persist and become detectable by people or equipment sensitive to such phenomena. I didn't know what to believe, didn't have enough knowledge of physics or neuroscience or consciousness studies to evaluate these theories adequately, didn't know whether any of them actually explained what I was observing or whether they were just attempts to create frameworks for experiences that didn't fit materialist models of reality. But reading about these ideas made me feel less isolated, made me realize that other people throughout history had encountered similar phenomena, had struggled with the same questions about death and persistence and the boundaries between states of existence. I'm not someone who believed in ghosts before this, not someone who thought consciousness persisted after death, not someone who accepted supernatural explanations for things that seemed unusual or unexplained. I was trained to think materially, practically, to find rational explanations for security incidents, to distinguish between actual threats and false alarms, to maintain professional skepticism about claims that couldn't be verified through observable evidence. My background was in criminal justice, had studied evidence analysis and threat assessment, had learned to question assumptions and verify information and maintain objectivity when investigating incidents or evaluating claims. But 7 years of night shifts watching security cameras had already taught me that reality was more complex than it appeared, that buildings at night contained rhythms and patterns that weren't visible during daytime operations, that empty spaces weren't really empty but were full of small movements and subtle presences that you only noticed if you paid close attention over extended periods. I'd learned that fluorescent lights hummed at different frequencies depending on their age and the ambient temperature, that concrete expanded and contracted creating small sounds like distant footsteps or closing doors, that HVAC systems created air currents that moved papers and trash in patterns that could look like deliberate movement if you weren't paying attention to the mechanical sources. I'd learned to distinguish between the ordinary strangeness of buildings after hours and actual anomalies requiring investigation, had developed an instinct for what was normal within the specific context of overnight operations and what represented genuine deviation from expected patterns. And this figure appearing every night at 2:17 was definitely deviation, was definitely anomaly, was definitely something that fell outside the range of ordinary overnight occurrences, even accounting for the various quirks and peculiarities that empty buildings displayed during the hours when human activity subsided. And now this figure appearing every night with mechanical precision, this nightly manifestation that the cameras documented but that left no physical trace, this presence that existed in that ambiguous space between recorded image and tangible reality, between digital documentation and physical verification, it was teaching me something else, something about the persistence of meaning beyond physical existence, about how places could hold memories or consciousness or some residual quality of the people who'd experienced significant moments there, about how death might not be as final or as absolute as our cultural assumptions suggested. I started talking to the figure during my shifts, started speaking out loud into the empty security booth at 2:17 when I knew it was standing there on level 3, when I could see it on the monitor facing the wall in that corner. I would say simple things, would acknowledge its presence, would express something like compassion or respect for whatever consciousness or awareness was maintaining this nightly vigil, was returning to this place with such remarkable consistency, was holding on to this location and this moment with a tenacity that transcended the normal dissolution of death. I see you, I would say, watching the monitor as the figure stood motionless in that corner. I know you're there. I don't understand why, but I know something happened to you here, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry you died alone. I'm sorry your family lost you. I'm sorry whatever keeps bringing you back. Sometimes I would tell him about my day, would share details about my life the way you might talk to someone you're keeping company with, someone who's present even if they can't respond, someone who exists in the space with you even if the nature of their existence is unclear. I would talk about my wife, about our daughter in college, about the ordinary frustrations and small pleasures of daily life, about the weather or the news or the books I was reading, just filling the silence with voice and human presence, creating a kind of companionship across whatever boundary separated us. I don't know if it hurt me, Don't know if whatever created that image on the camera also had the capacity to perceive sound or to understand language or to recognize that someone was attempting communication rather than just observation. But it felt important to try, felt like the right response to encountering something that seemed to be reaching across the boundary between life and death, between past and present, between the world of physical bodies and whatever other world or state might exist beyond or alongside it. My wife started noticing changes in me, started commenting on how I seemed distracted, how I talked about work more than I used to, how I seemed preoccupied with something I wasn't fully explaining. I tried to tell her about the figure on camera 12, tried to describe what I was seeing and what I thought it might mean, but I could tell she was uncomfortable with the topic, was uncertain how to respond to her husband talking about ghosts appearing on security cameras, about nightly manifestations that seemed to challenge basic assumptions about how reality worked. She suggested, gently, that maybe I should find different work, that 7 years of overnight shifts might be taking a toll I wasn't fully aware of, that isolation and unusual sleep patterns could create perceptual problems or make people see significance in things that were probably just routine technical issues or ordinary occurrences misinterpreted due to fatigue or stress. She wasn't dismissive exactly, wasn't suggesting I was crazy or hallucinating, just concerned that the work was affecting me in ways that might not be healthy, that might be creating problems I should address before they became more serious. Her name is Sarah. We've been married for 23 years, met in college when we were both studying completely different things, back when I thought I might become a teacher before switching to criminal justice and eventually ending up in private security. She works as a nurse at the same hospital that sends third-shift workers to park in this garage, though our schedules rarely overlap anymore, her working days while I work nights, both of us sleeping at different times, our marriage functioning in the gaps and overlaps of incompatible schedules that we've learned to navigate over 2 decades together. She'd supported my decision to take this job 7 years ago when I needed steadier work, when the retail security positions I'd been working were unpredictable and low-paying, when we needed better health insurance and more reliable income. The overnight shift paid a differential, made the wages acceptable, and the work was supposed to be easy, was supposed to be low stress, was supposed to be the kind of job where you could basically sit and read and get paid for being present rather than for doing anything particularly demanding. And it had been that, for the first 6.5 years, had been exactly the kind of undemanding overnight work that let me listen to podcasts and read books and basically just exist in the building, maintaining minimal vigilance for the rare occasions when something actually required attention or response. But now it had become something else, had become this consuming investigation into phenomena I didn't understand, this nightly engagement with a presence that seemed to exist at the edges of what I could perceive or comprehend, and Sarah could see that it was changing me, was affecting me in ways that worried her. And maybe she was right, maybe the overnight security work was affecting my perception and my judgment, maybe I was finding meaning in something that was actually just a camera glitch or a programming error or some technical artifact that had no connection to the man who died here 30 years ago or to any kind of persistent consciousness or supernatural presence. But I couldn't accept that explanation, couldn't dismiss what I was seeing as just equipment malfunction when it displayed such remarkable consistency, such precise timing, such clear definition that suggested genuine presence rather than digital artifact. So I kept working, kept watching, kept documenting the nightly appearances, kept maintaining my solitary vigil in the security booth while the figure maintained its vigil on level 3, both of us performing our respective roles in whatever drama or ritual or recurring moment was playing out in this parking garage night after night after night. And I kept researching, kept trying to find more information about Robert Chenoweth, kept looking for details that might help me understand what he was trying to communicate or accomplish or resolve through these nightly appearances. I found his widow eventually, found her through online searches and public records, found she was still alive and living in a retirement community about 60 miles from here, remarried many years ago to someone else, living what appeared to be a comfortable and ordinary life in her 70s. I thought about contacting her, thought about explaining what I'd been observing, thought about asking if she had any insights into why her first husband might still be connected to the parking garage where he'd died, whether there was unfinished business or unresolved emotions or something about his death that might explain why he seemed unable or unwilling to fully depart from that location. But I didn't contact her, couldn't bring myself to intrude on her current life with questions about a death 3 decades ago, couldn't justify disturbing whatever peace she'd found with reminders of loss and grief from so long ago, couldn't assume she'd believe me or take my observations seriously rather than dismissing them as the delusions of an overnight security guard who'd spent too much time alone watching monitors in the middle of the night. So I kept the information to myself, kept my investigation private, kept my observations contained within the context of my work rather than extending them into the lives of people who'd been affected by that long-ago death. The figure continued appearing every night at 2:17, continued its 45-second manifestation in that corner of level 3, continued existing in that space between documented and unexplained, between present and absent, between visible and intangible. And I continued watching, continued documenting, continued trying to understand what I was witnessing and what it meant about the nature of death and consciousness and the persistence of identity beyond physical existence. I started noticing other patterns in the garage, other subtle regularities that I'd previously ignored or dismissed as coincidental, other small anomalies that suggested the building contained more complexity than its simple function as vehicle storage would indicate. Certain cars appeared in the same spaces night after night, their owners maintaining precise consistency in their parking habits, creating rhythms that were probably just the result of habit and convenience but that also suggested something about human attachment to routine, about how we create small territories and maintain them with unconscious diligence, about how even parking garages become territories imbued with personal meaning and preference. There was a silver Honda Accord that parked in space 2 to 14 every single night, arriving around 11:30 and departing around 7 in the morning, so consistent that I could set my watch by it, so reliable that the one night it didn't appear I felt genuinely concerned, wondered if something had happened to its owner, felt relief when it resumed its normal pattern the following night. There was a red pickup truck that always took space 5 to 22, a blue sedan that preferred 4-08, a white SUV that invariably chose 1 to 33, all of them maintaining their territories with a consistency that suggested these weren't just random parking choices but rather deliberate selections, preferred locations that had become habitual through repeated use. Certain sounds occurred at regular times, the hum of HVAC systems cycling on and off according to programmed schedules, the click of lights in certain sections activating or deactivating, the distant rumble of the elevator machinery when someone called it from a different floor, all of it creating an acoustic landscape that varied throughout the night according to patterns that were initially invisible but became apparent through extended attention, through thousands of hours of listening while watching screens that usually showed nothing but motionless cars sitting under fluorescent lights. The HVAC system on level 4 made a particular rattling sound when it activated at 3:15 every morning, a sound I'd learned to anticipate, that marked the progression of the night as reliably as a clock. The lights on level 6 flickered briefly every night at 4:40, some minor electrical irregularity that created a momentary dimming across all the cameras monitoring that level, a quirk that had probably existed for years but that I'd only noticed through sustained observation. The elevator made different sounds depending on which floor it was traveling to, the machinery producing subtly different pitches and rhythms that became recognizable after you'd heard them thousands of times, that allowed me to track its movement through the building even when I wasn't actively watching the relevant cameras. And I started noticing other presences, other figures that appeared briefly on various cameras in different locations at different times, never with the consistency or precision of the figure on camera 12 but present nonetheless, momentary manifestations that might have been equipment glitches or might have been something else, might have been other people who died here or experienced significant moments here, might have been traces of the countless thousands of people who'd parked here. Over 35 years of continuous operation, might have been residual impressions left by all those brief visits and anonymous transactions and routine comings and goings. Camera 17 occasionally showed what looked like a child running across level 5, visible for just a few frames before disappearing, too quick and too fleeting to capture clearly but present enough that I'd seen it 3 or 4 times over the past month, always in the same general area, always moving in the same direction, always gone before I could focus the camera or get a clear view. Camera 24 sometimes captured shadows moving near the stairwell on level 2, shapes that didn't correspond to any physical presence on adjacent cameras, that seemed to exist independently of any person or object that should have been casting them. These sightings were less reliable than the figure on camera 12, less consistent and less clearly defined, easier to dismiss as glitches or perceptual errors or artifacts of tired eyes watching screens for too many hours. But they accumulated, created a sense that the garage was populated not just by cars and occasional living people but also by other presences, other echoes or traces or residual impressions that existed alongside the ordinary physical reality of concrete and steel and fluorescent light. The garage began to feel less like a simple commercial facility and more like a location where multiple temporalities intersected, where past and present coexisted in complex ways, where the boundary between what had been and what was remained permeable enough that traces of former presences could occasionally manifest to cameras that were designed to record the present but apparently could also capture echoes of other moments, other states, other aspects of reality that existed alongside or underneath the ordinary physical world we navigate during our daily lives. I started thinking about all the people who work night shifts in various buildings throughout every city, all the security guards and janitors and maintenance workers and overnight staff who spend hours alone in spaces that most people only experience during busy daytime operations. And I wondered how many of them noticed similar phenomena, how many of them encountered presences or patterns or anomalies that didn't fit normal frameworks but that they kept to themselves, kept private, kept contained within their own experience rather than reporting or discussing or trying to get others to acknowledge or validate. Because there's something about overnight work in empty buildings that changes perception, that makes you notice things that remain invisible during daytime operations, that creates a kind of attentiveness to subtle qualities of space and time that busy schedules and constant activity normally prevent. The parking garage at night is different from the parking garage during the day, not just in terms of reduced traffic and fewer people but in some fundamental way that affects how reality operates, how time flows, how boundaries between states remain stable or become permeable. The absence of crowds and activity creates a kind of silence that isn't just acoustic but also energetic, a stillness that allows other qualities of the space to become apparent, other frequencies or vibrations or presences that normally get drowned out by the noise and movement of normal operations. It's like how you can see stars better when you're away from city lights, how the absence of one kind of illumination allows you to perceive other kinds of light that were always there but couldn't be detected through the glare of more immediate sources. And maybe that's why the figure appears at 2:17 every night. Maybe there's something about that time, about that specific moment in the rotation of Earth and the progression of hours, that makes manifestation possible, That opens a window between whatever state the dead exist in and the physical world where cameras can detect them and record them and preserve them as digital files that can be reviewed and studied and pondered by living people trying to understand what they're seeing. And what it means. 2:17 is deep night, is the hour when circadian rhythms reach their lowest point, when body temperature drops and metabolism slows and consciousness itself seems to operate differently, more dreamlike, more receptive to impressions and perceptions that daytime awareness filters out or dismisses. It's the hour when hospitals see the most deaths, when people sleeping peacefully simply fail to wake, when whatever force or energy or biological imperative that keeps us alive seems weakest, most likely to let go, most willing to release its hold on physical existence. Maybe Robert Chenoweth died at 2:17, maybe that was the exact moment when his heart stopped beating or his brain ceased functioning, and maybe something about that moment, something about the specific state of consciousness or awareness he experienced as he crossed that boundary, created conditions for ongoing manifestation, created a kind of anchor point that pulled him back or held him here or allowed some aspect of his identity to persist in this location, marking this moment. Maintaining this connection to the physical world even decades after his body had been buried and decomposed and returned to the earth. I started keeping a more detailed journal, started writing down not just observations of the figure on camera 12 but also my thoughts about death and consciousness and persistence, my speculations about what happens when we die, my questions about whether identity survives the dissolution of physical form, whether something of who we are continues beyond the stopping of heartbeat and breath and brain activity, whether places can hold memories or consciousnesses or residual presences that remain accessible under certain conditions to certain kinds of observation. The journal became a kind of companion during the long overnight shifts, became a way of processing and organizing and attempting to make sense of experiences that didn't fit easily into the categories I'd been using to understand my work and my life and my assumptions about how reality operated. Writing helped, made the strangeness feel more manageable, more like something I was investigating deliberately rather than something that was happening to me passively, more like a project I'd chosen to undertake rather than a mystery that had chosen me to receive it. I wrote about the temperature anomalies in the corner of level 3, about the way sound seemed to die there, about the persistent sense of weight or presence that I felt when standing in that location. I wrote about Robert Chenoweth's life as I'd learned it from obituaries and articles, about his work as an accountant, his family, his hobbies, his plans for a vacation that never happened. I wrote about my own life, about how this job had changed me, about what it meant to spend 7 years watching screens in the middle of the night, about how sustained observation of empty spaces had taught me to notice things that most people never see, patterns and presences and subtle qualities of reality that remain invisible to casual perception. The journal filled one notebook, then another, accumulating pages of observations and speculations and questions, creating a record of this extended encounter with something that existed at the margins of acknowledged reality, something that cameras could capture but that physical presence couldn't verify. Something that suggested the world contained more mystery and complexity than our everyday frameworks allowed us to recognize or comprehend. My supervisor called me in for another conversation about 6 months after the figure had started appearing, told me that some of the other guards had expressed concern about my focus on the camera 12 phenomena, that there were questions about whether I was maintaining adequate attention to actual security matters. That the owners of the garage were wondering if maybe I needed to be reassigned or replaced with someone who would focus on the basic requirements of the job rather than pursuing investigations into unexplained camera images that had no clear security implications. I assured him I was still performing my duties adequately, was still monitoring all the cameras and responding to actual incidents and maintaining the documentation and reports that the job required, that my interest in the figure on camera 12 hadn't compromised my ability to do the work I was hired to do. He seemed skeptical but not entirely unsympathetic, seemed to understand that 7 years of overnight shifts created certain psychological pressures, certain needs for stimulation or meaning or something to focus attention on beyond the ordinary monotony of watching mostly empty parking levels night after night. He told me to keep doing my job professionally, to maintain focus on actual security matters, to document the figure if I wanted to but not to let it become a distraction from legitimate responsibilities. And he suggested, not quite as a directive but more strongly than just casual advice, that I should consider moving to day shift when a position opened up, that maybe it was time for me to experience the building during normal operating hours, to work with more colleagues around, to have more interaction and less isolation, to break the pattern of 7 years of overnight work that might be creating the conditions for obsessive focus on things that probably didn't warrant the attention I was giving them. I thanked him and said I'd consider it, but I knew I wouldn't take day shift if it was offered, knew I needed to continue working nights as long as the figure continued appearing. As long as there was something to observe and document and try to understand about this nightly manifestation in the parking garage where I'd spent 7 years watching screens and maintaining solitary vigil over concrete levels full of parked cars and occasional mysterious presences that existed in the spaces between recorded and real, between documented and explained, between visible and comprehensible. The figure continues appearing every night at 2:17, continues its 45-second manifestation in that corner of level 3, continues existing with a consistency that suggests intention and meaning even though I still don't understand what that intention is or what that meaning might be. And I continue watching, continue documenting, continue my own nightly vigil in the security booth, serving as witness to something that most people will never see, that most people would dismiss or ignore or rationalize away if they did see it. That exists at the margins of acknowledgement where phenomena that don't fit our frameworks persist regardless of whether we recognize them or take them seriously or allow them to challenge our assumptions about what's possible. Sometimes now, late in my shift when exhaustion makes the boundaries between states feel thinner, I wonder if I'm becoming like Robert Chenoweth, if I'm becoming attached to this place in ways that might persist beyond my own eventual death, if spending so many hours here watching and waiting and bearing witness is creating connections that will hold me here even after my body stops functioning, even after whatever consciousness I possess should logically dissipate or move on or cease to exist. In any form that could manifest to future security guards watching future cameras in this same space. I wonder if decades from now, some other overnight worker will notice a new figure appearing on the monitors, will see me standing in my booth or walking my rounds or pausing in that corner on level 3 where Robert stands every night, will try to investigate and understand and make sense of another presence that refuses to fully depart, that maintains its connection to this building through mechanisms we don't understand, through processes that our materialist frameworks can't account for. Through whatever force or energy or quality of consciousness allows some aspects of human experience to persist beyond the dissolution of physical form. The parking garage security guard after midnight, that's who I am now, that's the role I've accepted, watching screens that show both the ordinary present and occasionally something else, something that suggests the past isn't quite past, that the dead aren't quite gone, that consciousness or identity or something essential about human existence can persist beyond physical death in forms that cameras can detect but that we don't have adequate frameworks for understanding or explaining or incorporating into our normal models of how buildings and time and reality function. And every night at 2:17 I watch camera 12 and I wait for the figure to appear, and when it does I acknowledge it silently, recognize its presence, honor its persistence, serve as witness to whatever vigil it's maintaining in that corner where someone died 30 years ago, where something about that death created conditions for ongoing manifestation, for nightly return, for connection between then and now that transcends the normal progression of time and the usual finality of death. The figure standing there facing the wall, still and silent, present for 45 seconds before vanishing, appearing with mechanical precision night after night after night, existing in that space between states, between documented and explained, between visible and understood. And me sitting in my booth watching it on the screen, documenting it in my journal, trying to comprehend what it means, what it's showing me, what truth it's revealing about the nature of death and consciousness and the persistence of presence beyond physical existence, beyond the neat categories we use to organize our experience, beyond the comfortable assumptions that let us pretend we understand how reality works when really we're just ignoring everything that doesn't fit our limited frameworks, everything that suggests the world is stranger and more permeable and more full of mystery than we usually acknowledge during our busy daylight lives. That's what I've learned from 7 years of overnight security work, from 6 months of watching the figure on camera 12 appear and disappear with such remarkable consistency. I've learned that parking garages contain more than just parked cars, that buildings hold memories and presences and residual qualities of the people who've experienced significant moments within them, that death isn't quite as final as we like to believe, that consciousness or identity or something essential persists in ways our materialist frameworks can't account for, but that surveillance cameras can sometimes capture, can sometimes document, can sometimes reveal to those of us who work night shifts in empty buildings, who watch screens for hours while the world sleeps, who remain attentive to subtle presences and unexplained patterns and the strange rhythms that emerge when human activity subsides and allows other qualities of reality to become visible, to become apparent, to become undeniable even to those of us who were trained to dismiss or ignore or rationalize away anything that doesn't fit the comfortable categories we inherited from culture and science and the everyday assumptions that make life feel manageable and comprehensible. The parking garage security guard after midnight, watching and documenting and bearing witness to mysteries that most people never encounter, to phenomena that exist at the edges of recognition, to truths about death and persistence and the permeability of boundaries between states that cameras reveal but that we're not trained to see, not encouraged to acknowledge, not equipped to understand within the frameworks we inherit. But they exist nonetheless, these presences and patterns and echoes of former lives, existing whether we notice them or not, whether we believe in them or not, whether we have adequate language to describe them or not, persisting in the quiet hours when buildings empty and normal activity ceases and the world reveals aspects of itself that remain hidden during the busy daylight operations when we're too distracted to notice, too committed to our assumptions to perceive, too invested in our limited frameworks to allow for the possibility that reality might be stranger and more mysterious and more full of continuing presence than we've been taught to believe.